Hey, welcome back, friend. Or if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found your way to this little corner of the night. Pull up your blanket, get comfortable, maybe turn the lights down just a little. Tonight we're going on a journey together, and I promise you, by the end of it, you will never look at something as ordinary as a calendar the same way again. Here's something I want you to think about right now, before we go any further. You woke up this morning, maybe you checked your phone, you saw the date, September something, or October, November, December, and you just accepted it. Didn't question it for even a second. But what if I told you that those names, September, October, November, December, are actually wrong? Not wrong like someone made a typo. Wrong like the whole thing is a 2,000-year-old mistake that nobody ever bothered to fix. September literally means the 7th month. October means the 8th month. November, the 9th. December, the 10th. And yet here we are, living in a world where December is the 12th month, and nobody seems to mind one bit. So tonight, the question is this. How did an ancient Roman general's ego, and a calendar that was so broken it once had a year with 445 days, become the invisible structure that organizes every single day of your life? Before we step into the story, I want to take just a moment. If this kind of content has ever made your evenings a little better, a little softer, I would genuinely love it if you hit subscribe and left a like. It really does make a difference for a small channel like this. And hey, I am curious. Where are you right now while you're watching this? Are you in bed already? Or maybe still on your couch? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing. All right. Lights soft, maybe a fan going in the background, and let's go. To understand how we got here, we need to go all the way back. Not to Julius Caesar, not yet, but to a man named Romulus. Yes, that Romulus. The legendary founder of Rome himself. The one who was supposedly raised by a wolf. And let me tell you, his calendar was about as chaotic as that childhood sounds. Around 750 years before the birth of Christ, the early Romans used a calendar with only 10 months. 10. The year started in March, named for Mars, the god of war, and ran through to December, which, as we noted, they correctly counted as the 10th month. And then winter arrived, and they simply stopped counting. The months of what we now call January and February did not officially exist. Winter was just a formless, unnamed stretch of time. The Romans looked at those cold, dark months and basically said, you know what, we are not going to dignify this with a name. There is something almost poetic about that, actually. An entire season too miserable to be officially acknowledged. Now, this 10-month system worked well enough when you're a small farming community and your main concern is planting and harvesting. March through December covered the agricultural year just fine. But as Rome grew, and as life became more complicated, having months that wandered freely against the actual position of the sun started causing real problems. Festivals ended up in the wrong seasons. Religious ceremonies were timed incorrectly. Court dates, market days, military campaigns, everything began to slip. So around 713 years before the birth of Christ, though historians debate the exact date, Rome's second king, a man named Numa Pompilius, decided to fix things. He added 2 new months. January, named for Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and doorways. And February, named for the word februar, which referred to purification rituals. He placed these 2 new months at the beginning of the year, which bumped every existing month forward. And here is where the mess begins. The mess that you and I still live inside today. The 6 months that used to be named for their position, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th. Those names did not change. They stayed exactly as they were, Quintilis, Sextilis, September, October, November, December. The 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. But now, with January and February added at the front, those months had moved 2 spots forward. The month that was called 7th was now actually the 9th month on the calendar. The month called 10th was now the 12th, and the Romans just left it. Nobody went back and renamed everything. They kept the old numbers attached to the new positions and moved on with their lives. This is the original sin of the modern calendar, and we are still living with it today. But the chaos did not stop there, not even close. Numa's reformed calendar had 355 days, which sounds close to our current 365 days, but that 10-day gap adds up quickly. Every year, the calendar fell a little further behind the actual movement of the sun. To patch this, Roman priests, called pontifices, were given the authority to add extra days or even an entire extra month, called Mercedonius, whenever they felt the calendar needed correcting. And here is where things get truly remarkable. Because those priests discovered that their power over the calendar was actually power over almost everything else. Think about it. In ancient Rome, the calendar was not just about time. It determined which days were legal for court proceedings, which days markets could operate, which days contracts could be signed, which days were sacred, and therefore no official business could be conducted at all. If a priest added an extra month, he could extend a friendly official's term in office. If he skipped adding necessary days, he could cut short an enemy's term. He could delay elections or rush them. He could make a debt come due early or push it back indefinitely. The calendar was a weapon, and the priests who controlled it used it without mercy. By the time Julius Caesar came to power in the 1st century before the birth of Christ, this system had been abused so badly for so long that the calendar had drifted nearly 3 months off from the actual solar year. Harvest festivals were falling in summer. Winter celebrations were happening in autumn. Caesar himself, in his role as one of the chief priests, had at times deliberately skipped adding correction months during his years of military campaigning, because it suited his political purposes to do so. The calendar was, to put it plainly, a disaster. And Caesar, brilliant, ruthless, ambitious Caesar, knew it. He had spent time in Egypt, and there he encountered something that must have struck him like a lightning bolt. The Egyptians had been using a solar calendar of 365 days for thousands of years. Steady, reliable, aligned with the actual sun. He came back to Rome and said, in effect, "We are fixing this for good." What happened next is one of the most dramatic moments in the history of timekeeping, and almost nobody talks about it. In 46 years before the birth of Christ, Caesar sat down with an Alexandrian astronomer named Sosigenes, a man who had travelled from Egypt to help Rome solve its temporal crisis. Together they calculated exactly how far the Roman calendar had drifted from the true solar year. The answer, 67 days. The Roman calendar was 67 days wrong. To fix it, Caesar did something almost incomprehensible. He declared that the year 46 before the birth of Christ would not have 355 days. It would have 445 days. He simply inserted 3 extra months into that single year, 2 of them wedged between November and December, to bring the calendar back into alignment with the sun. The Romans called it the last year of confusion. Can you imagine? You go to sleep on what you think is an autumn evening, and you wake up and somehow it is the middle of summer. Not because of anything natural, just because a man with absolute power decided the calendar needed correcting. Imagine trying to explain to your neighbour why there is a whole extra month between Tuesday and Wednesday. This month is called Intercalaris Posterior. No, I did not make that up. Yes, it was a real month. No, It only existed once. Welcome to Rome. Then Caesar announced that from January the 1st, in 45 years before the birth of Christ, the world would run on a new system. 365 days per year. Every 4 years, 1 extra day would be added to February. No more priests deciding when to add months. No more manipulation. The year would simply follow the sun. This was the Julian calendar, and it changed everything. Now here is where Caesar's personal ambition enters the picture, because of course it does. He is Julius Caesar. The month that had been called Quintilis, the old 5th month, which was now sitting in the 7th position, happened to be the month of Caesar's birth. And so, almost certainly with Caesar's enthusiastic approval, the Roman Senate voted to rename it. Quintilis became Julius, July, named for Julius Caesar, a month that would carry his name for as long as human civilization counted time. He was assassinated in March of 44 years before the birth of Christ. He never got to see his month become permanent, but it did. It has now been named for him for over 2,000 years. His successor, his great-nephew and adopted son Octavian, who had become the Emperor Augustus, watched what happened with July and had what we might charitably describe as the same idea. The month that had been called Sextilis, the old 6th month, now sitting in the 8th position, was renamed in 8 years before the birth of Christ. It became Augustus, August, named for the emperor himself. Now you have probably heard the story that Augustus was so jealous of Julius having a 31-day month that he stole a day from February to make August equally long. Historians today believe this story is actually a myth, a medieval invention. But the fact that so many people believed it for centuries says something beautiful about how we project very human feelings onto very powerful men. Of course, Augustus would want his month to be just as long as Caesar's. That is the most relatable thing about either of them. So by now, we have a calendar that begins with January and February, the months that were added by a Roman king to fill the nameless winter. We have March, April, May and June, named for gods, goddesses and various Latin concepts. We have July and August, named for men who wanted to be remembered forever. And then we have September, October, November and December, still proudly wearing their original Latin number names, still stubbornly calling themselves the 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th, even though they are the 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th. This is the calendar you use every single day of your life. But the story does not end with Caesar and Augustus, because the Julian calendar, brilliant as it was, had a small flaw. Sosigenes had calculated the solar year at 365 1/4 days, so every 4 years, 1 extra day was added. Perfect, right? Almost. The actual solar year is not exactly 365 1/4 days. It is very slightly shorter, about 11 minutes shorter per year. 11 minutes does not sound like much, but over 1,600 years, 11 minutes per year accumulates into 10 full days. By the 1500s, astronomers had noticed that the spring equinox, the day when day and night are equally long, was arriving 10 days earlier than the calendar said it should. This was causing serious problems for the Christian Church, because the date of Easter is calculated based on the spring equinox, and if the equinox is in the wrong place on the calendar, then Easter is wrong, and then everything built around Easter is wrong. Pope Gregory XIII assembled a team of mathematicians and astronomers and set them to work. In 1582 he announced a correction. First, 10 days would simply be removed from October of that year. October the 4th was followed directly by October the 15th. People who went to sleep on a Thursday night woke up on a Friday that was 10 days later. Imagine checking your phone in the morning and watching the date jump forward by 10 days. Some people were furious. Landlords still wanted a full month's rent for October, even with the missing days. Workers felt cheated, and many Protestant nations, who had no great love for taking orders from the Pope, refused to adopt the Gregorian calendar for generations. The British Empire, including all of its American colonies, did not switch until 1752. When they did, they had to remove 11 days. There are legends of mobs in London shouting, "Give us back our 11 days," though historians debate whether this was a widespread protest or a more isolated reaction. Either way, the change eventually spread. Japan adopted it in 1872, Korea in 1895. Greece, the last country in Europe, did not switch until 1923. And the result of all of this? The Gregorian calendar, the calendar you use right now, which is, at its heart, the Julian calendar, Caesar's calendar, with a small patch applied to fix the 11-minute error that a man in ancient Egypt had miscalculated over 2,000 years ago. So let's sit with this for a moment. You are living on a calendar that was designed by a Roman king who needed to name the winter, revised by a Roman politician who needed to control his enemies, renamed twice by two men who wanted their legacies to outlive their bodies, broken by priests who used time as a political weapon, repaired by a military dictator with an Egyptian astronomer, and patched by a pope who was worried about the date of Easter. Every time you write today's date, every time you say, "See you in September," every time a December holiday feels wrong somehow because it is dark but the month is called the 10th, you are touching all of that history. You are living in a structure built by people who have been dead for 2,000 years, and they are still, quietly, organizing your days. That is not a small thing. That is extraordinary. And the calendar is just the beginning. Because if the Romans left their fingerprints on something as fundamental as time itself, you can only imagine what they did to the laws that govern your property, the language you think in, the government that rules you, and even the ring on your finger, which is exactly where our story's going next. And I think you are going to find that one even more surprising than this one. Picture this for a moment. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is getting down on one knee. They are nervous, their heart is pounding, and in their hand they are holding a small box with a ring inside, almost certainly placed on the fourth finger of the left hand. They probably have no idea why that finger. They just know that is what you do, that instinct, that certainty about which finger and which hand goes all the way back to a belief that Roman physicians held as absolute medical truth, a belief that every single modern anatomist knows is completely, demonstrably false. And yet here we are, 2,000 years later, still doing exactly what those Romans told us to do. So let's talk about love, and rings, and the surprisingly complicated business of getting married in ancient Rome. The Romans called it the vena amoris, the vein of love. They believed, and this was not folklore, this was considered serious medical thinking at the time, that a vein ran directly from the fourth finger of the left hand straight to the heart. Not a general network of blood vessels like we understand today. A dedicated singular channel connecting that one finger to the most emotionally significant organ in the human body. The Roman writer Macrobius, writing around the late 4th and early 5th centuries after the birth of Christ, described it in clinical detail. He had, he said, consulted books on anatomy and discovered the truth, that there is a certain nerve originating in the heart and running from there to the finger next to the little finger of the left hand. Notice he says nerve, not vein. The Romans sometimes used the words interchangeably, which tells you something about the state of anatomy in the ancient world. But the point was the same. That specific finger was believed to be in direct conversation with the heart itself, and so when a Roman man wanted to mark a formal promise to marry, he placed a ring on that finger, The logic was almost unbearably romantic for a culture that was otherwise quite unsentimental about marriage. By encircling that finger with a ring, you were, in a sense, encircling the heart. Here is what I find quietly amazing about this. The physician William Harvey did not prove how blood actually circulates through the human body until 1628. For centuries before that, through the Roman Empire, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, nobody knew that veins do not work like dedicated pipelines. All veins lead back to the heart, yes, but through a shared system. There is no special vein for the ring finger. There never was. And yet by the time Harvey made his discovery, the custom of the ring finger was already so deeply embedded in culture that the new science changed absolutely nothing. People kept putting rings on that finger. They still do. You probably do. A myth was more powerful than the truth. And honestly, I think that says something beautiful about how humans work. But the ring on the finger was just one small piece of a much larger ceremony that the Romans designed from the ground up. A ceremony so detailed, so layered with meaning, that its echoes are still ringing through every wedding you have ever attended. Think about the last wedding you went to. Or better yet, think about what you picture when someone says the word wedding. A white dress, a veil, flowers, bridesmaids in matching outfits, the groom waiting at the altar, guests throwing something at the happy couple as they walk out. A celebration in June, if at all possible. I want to go through each of those images with you, because almost every single one of them comes from Rome. Let's start with the white dress. The Roman bride wore a garment called the tunica recta, a plain, straight, white woolen tunic. And here is the detail that always surprises people. She wove it herself the night before her wedding. Not because the family could not afford a seamstress, because weaving it herself was a demonstration of her domestic virtue, her skill, her readiness to run a household. The act of making the dress was as significant as wearing it. Now, most people believe the white wedding dress became a tradition because of Queen Victoria, who wore white at her wedding in 1840. And that is true. Victoria's choice absolutely cemented white as the dominant colour of Western bridal fashion. But the association between brides and white fabric is far, far older. The Romans wore white for reasons that had nothing to do with purity in the Victorian sense. White, in Roman belief, was the colour of protection. White wool, in particular, was thought to repel evil forces and shield the wearer from malevolent spirits. The bride needed that protection because on her wedding day, she occupied a terrifying in-between space. She had left the protection of her father's household gods, but had not yet entered the protection of her husband's. She was spiritually exposed, vulnerable, walking through an invisible gap in the divine order. The white tunic was her armour. Victoria reinvented the meaning. The Romans invented the impulse. And then there is the veil. In ancient Rome, the bridal veil was called the flammeum. It was not white. It was a deep, vivid flame colour. Orange-red, like fire, like sunrise, like the colour of saffron. The flammeum covered the bride from her head nearly to her feet. In fact, the Latin word for a woman getting married, nubere, literally meant to veil oneself. The veil was so central to the ceremony that it essentially was the ceremony, at least symbolically. Why the dramatic orange? Because in Roman belief, fire and light were forces powerful enough to frighten off the evil spirits that stalked brides on their wedding days. The flame colour was not decorative. It was functional. It was meant to make the bride look fierce, almost supernatural, too blazing to approach. Over centuries, as Rome became Christian and Christian Europe inherited Roman customs, the flammeum survived, but its colour shifted. The dramatic orange softened, faded, eventually became white or ivory to align with newer ideas about purity. But the veil itself? it never left. The custom of veiling the bride remained so unquestioned, so deeply woven into the fabric of what a wedding was supposed to look like, that nobody, no council, no pope, no reformer, ever thought to question it. One early Christian theologian actually wrote that the Christian wedding had preserved the Roman ceremony almost entirely. He said, and I'm quoting loosely here, that except for the taking of religious auspices, Christian ritual had preserved the Roman nuptial rite in full, everything down to the bridal wreath, everything down to the bridal wreath. Have you ever wondered about bridesmaids? Not who to choose, but why they exist at all? In Rome, bridesmaids and groomsmen served a purpose that had nothing to do with moral support or Instagram photos. According to Roman belief, evil spirits who wanted to harm a marriage could not always identify the bride and groom in a crowd. So the wedding party, typically 5 women and 5 men, dressed in clothing very similar to the bride and groom, creating a kind of decoy group. The spirits would be confused. They could not tell which woman was the actual bride, which man was the actual groom. By the time they figured it out, the ceremony would be over. This is why bridesmaids wear matching dresses. This is why groomsmen wear matching suits. Not because it looks good in photographs. Because 2,000 years ago, Romans believed that evil forces could be confused by coordinated outfits. Think about that next time you are agonizing over whether your bridesmaids should wear sage green or dusty rose. And what about the month of June? This is one that people often cite as a Victorian or American invention, the idea that June is the ideal month for weddings. But the preference for June goes back to Rome, and it has an extremely specific origin. The month of June was named for the goddess Juno, who was not just any goddess. Juno was the queen of the gods, the divine protector of women, and specifically the goddess of marriage and childbirth. Her full title in the context of weddings was Juno Pronuba. Juno, the matron of honour, if you will, the goddess who presided over the joining of lives. Getting married in June was not a stylistic preference. It was considered an act of spiritual alignment. You were getting married in the goddess's own month, under her direct gaze and protection. The Romans who could afford to wait until June did so deliberately, with intention, because they believed it made the union more likely to endure. The goddess is long gone from Western consciousness, but her month is still packed with weddings every year. And then there is the matter of May. Romans considered May to be deeply unlucky for weddings. The month was associated with the Lemuria, a festival during which the spirits of the restless dead were believed to walk the earth and threaten the living. Getting married in May was considered practically an invitation for disaster. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century before the birth of Christ, recorded the saying that went around at the time, "The bad wed in May." It was not an observation, it was a warning. Here is the thing that makes me laugh a little. Even today, May is statistically one of the less popular months for weddings in the United States and the United Kingdom, well behind June, September and October. Nobody is consciously following the Roman rule. Nobody's thinking about Lemuria or restless spirits. They just feel, somehow, that May is not quite right for a wedding. 2,000 years of cultural memory, running quietly in the background. Let me tell you about one more Roman wedding custom, because this one is truly hidden in plain sight. At a Roman wedding, after the ceremony was complete, the couple made their way to the groom's home. The bride was escorted through the streets by a procession of friends and family, and as she walked, guests called out bawdy songs and threw things at her and the groom. What did they throw? Small nuts. Nuts were a symbol of fertility, of seeds, of new life, of abundance. The throwing of nuts was a wish for children, for prosperity, for the union to bear fruit. The nuts became rice, the rice became confetti, the confetti became flower petals and sometimes birdseed, because venues started worrying about guests slipping. But the act, the crowd throwing something small at the couple as they walk out together, has not changed in 2,000 years. The only thing that has changed is what lands in your hair. And there is one more thing. At the end of the Roman wedding procession, a torch was carried at the front of the group. After the couple crossed the threshold of their new home together, that torch was tossed back into the crowd of waiting guests. Whoever caught it was considered to be next in line for good fortune, for marriage, for luck. The torch became a bouquet of flowers. The bouquet toss at a wedding reception, that beautiful, slightly chaotic moment where the bride throws flowers over her shoulder and everyone scrambles, is a direct, unbroken descendant of a Roman torch toss that was happening in the streets of Rome more than 2,000 years ago. Does that not make you see the whole thing differently? I want to pause here for a moment, because there is something deeper worth sitting with. When we look at all of these customs together, the ring finger, the white dress, the veil, the bridesmaids in matching clothes, the June preference, the tossing of things at the couple, the bouquet, what strikes me most is not just how many of them survived, it is how they survived. None of these traditions were preserved by law. Nobody mandated that you must throw something at newlyweds. Nobody wrote it into a legal code that bridesmaids should dress alike. These customs travelled through time in the most fragile possible vehicle, human imitation. One generation watched the one before it, copied what felt right, carried it forward. The meaning shifted. The materials changed, the gods were forgotten, but the shape of the ritual endured. There is something deeply human in that. We are creatures who organize our most important moments, the moments when we're most vulnerable, most hopeful, most exposed, through ceremony. And the ceremonies we reach for are almost always the ones we inherited. Even when we do not know we're inheriting anything at all. You carry Rome to every wedding you attend. You've been carrying it your whole life, and that, it turns out, is not even close to the most surprising inheritance Rome left us. Because while love and marriage are perhaps the most personal domain of human life, there is another domain that is even more intimate, one that shapes not just your most important days, but every single ordinary day. The language inside your head, the words you use to think. What we have not talked about yet is how the Roman way of speaking, their whole philosophy of argument, persuasion and structured thought, quietly became the architecture of the Western mind itself, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. There is a word you use today, maybe several hundred of them, and the strange thing is, you did not choose most of them. They were handed to you, already shaped, already carrying the fingerprints of people who have been dead for 2,000 years. Language feels so personal, doesn't it? The way you put sentences together, the words you reach for when you're trying to explain something difficult, the phrases that rise to the surface when you are moved or angry, or trying to sound smart in a meeting. It all feels like yours. Like something that grew from the inside out. But here is the thing nobody tells you in school. When linguists actually count the words in the English dictionary, all of them, from the everyday to the obscure, roughly 60% trace their origins to Latin or languages descended from it. 60%. And in scientific, legal and medical vocabulary, that number climbs past 90. So the language you think in, the language you dream in, was built, in enormous part, by Rome. But let's not start with vocabulary, because that is almost too easy. Words we can accept. Words travel. Words get borrowed. What is harder to accept, and what I find genuinely fascinating, is that the Romans did not just give us words. They gave us an entire philosophy of how to think. Let me introduce you to a man named Marcus Tullius Cicero, Born in January of 106 years before the birth of Christ in a small town called Arpinum, about 60 miles southeast of Rome, Cicero was not supposed to be powerful. He came from a wealthy enough family, yes, but not from the old Roman aristocracy, not from the families whose names carried automatic weight in the Senate, whose ancestors had consuls and generals stretching back generations. He was, in the cutting language of Roman social hierarchy, a new man, a novus homo, someone who had made himself rather than been born into it. And he made himself into perhaps the greatest speaker the Roman world had ever seen. What Cicero understood, and what he systematized with almost obsessive precision, was that effective communication was not a gift. It was a technology. It could be broken down, studied, taught, practiced, and reproduced. He wrote about it at extraordinary length, works called On the Orator, Brutus the Orator, and in his younger years a dense manual called On Invention that became the most widely copied book in medieval Europe, second only to the Bible itself. Think about that for a moment. An ancient Roman handbook on argumentation, more copied than any other secular text for over 1,000 years. What was in it? 5 principles that Cicero believed underpinned all effective communication. He called them the 5 canons of rhetoric. Invention, the discovery of your argument, what you actually want to say. Arrangement, putting your points in the right order. Style, choosing the right language for your audience. Memory, internalizing your material until it flows freely. Delivery, controlling your voice, your pauses, your body, your pace. Sound familiar? Every public speaking course you have ever seen, every communications class at every university in the Western world, every TED Talk coaching session, every podcast training manual, every YouTube video about how to be more confident on camera, all of it descends, with startling directness, from those 5 canons. Cicero's framework did not inspire modern communication theory. It literally is modern communication theory, lightly rephrased, and yet most people who teach it have no idea where it came from. Now here is where I want to share something that I think gets overlooked even in academic discussions of Cicero. He was not just teaching people to speak well. He had a much more radical idea underneath it all. Cicero believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that the ability to argue clearly and persuade thoughtfully was civilization's most important technology. Not military might, not economic strength, language. The organized, disciplined, honest use of language to move people toward truth and toward justice. He wrote that a society where people could not argue well would inevitably fall into the hands of those who spoke loudly, crudely, and emotionally. Men who used language to manipulate rather than illuminate. He was right, and he was also, tragically, a living demonstration of his own point. In 43 years before the birth of Christ, after decades of defending the Roman Republic with his words, after his famous speeches dismantling the conspiracy of Catiline, after his elegant arguments in hundreds of courtroom defences, after a political career in which he genuinely tried to use persuasion rather than force, Cicero was declared an enemy of the state by Mark Antony. Soldiers found him on a country road trying to escape, carried in a litter because he was old and ill. He was executed there, on that road. His head and his hands were cut off and brought to Rome, where Mark Antony's wife reportedly stabbed his tongue with a hairpin, a final savage act of revenge against the words that had so often defeated her husband in public debate. The man who'd spent his entire life arguing that language was more powerful than violence was silenced by violence. But here is what I keep coming back to, quietly, when I think about Cicero. His words survived. Every weapon that killed him has crumbled to dust. Every man who ordered his death is remembered today only because historians wrote about them in the language Cicero perfected. 2060 years after his execution, his textbooks are still shaping how humans learn to argue. The pen, or in his case, the written scroll, really did outlast the sword. So let's talk about what this means for your actual everyday life. Think about the last time you had to write something persuasive, a work email trying to get approval for an idea, a cover letter, an argument you were making to a friend about something that mattered to you, a complaint letter to a company, maybe just a text message trying to convince someone to change plans. What did you do instinctively? You probably started with what was at stake, why this matters. You made your main point clearly. You anticipated the counter-argument and addressed it. You ended with what you wanted the person to do or feel. That structure, the one that felt natural to you, the one that just makes sense, is called a classical argument, and it is Roman. Not vaguely inspired by Rome. Roman. The formula you reach for without thinking is the formula that Cicero's students taught to their students, who taught it to medieval scholars, who taught it to Renaissance humanists, who put it into the first universities, who created the curriculum that shaped every school in the Western world. You are arguing like a Roman and you do not even know it. And it goes deeper than argument structure. It goes all the way into the individual words themselves. Here is a small experiment you can run right now, in your head. Think of the most common ordinary English words. Words like go, come, eat, drink, love, see, hear, walk, run, sun, moon, sky, fire, water. These are the words you use most often, the words that feel oldest and most native in your mouth. Almost all of them are Germanic, descended from the Anglo-Saxon that was spoken in England long before Rome had much influence there. Now think of words that feel slightly more formal, slightly more elevated. Words like communicate, observe, proceed, illuminate, consider, demonstrate, accumulate, evaluate, contemplate. Every single one of those is Latin, rooted in the language of Rome, passed through French after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, and eventually absorbed into English. What this creates, and this is what I find so extraordinary about English specifically, is a language with two registers living side by side. The intimate, earthy Germanic layer for everyday feeling and action, and the Roman layer for thought, formality, and precision. When you say, I love you, you're speaking Germanic. When you say, I feel a deep and enduring affection, you're speaking Roman. Same feeling, completely different heritage. And here is what the Romans added that the Germanic layer alone could not have provided: abstraction. Words like justice, liberty, conscience, reason, virtue, constitution, republic. These are the words Western civilization uses to think about itself, to describe its highest ideals and its worst failures. They are all Latin. The vocabulary of freedom is Roman. The vocabulary of law is Roman. The vocabulary of moral reflection is Roman. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the fact that Rome was the culture that first formalized the idea of arguing about how society should be organized, in writing, in public, in a language that could be studied and transmitted. When the West needed words for its biggest concepts, it reached for the language of the culture that had first thought seriously about those concepts. Can I tell you one of my favorite small examples of this? The word candidate. In Roman times, a man seeking political office would appear in public dressed in a toga that had been whitened with chalk, a bright, almost blinding white. The Latin word for chalked or whitened was candidatus. He literally dressed in white to show the voters that he was clean, pure, untarnished by corruption. So every time a politician today calls themselves a candidate, they are unknowingly promising, in the ghost language of Rome, that they are as pure as chalk-white cloth. Draw your own conclusions about how well that promise has been kept, or consider the word salary. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with an allocation of salt, an extraordinarily valuable commodity in the ancient world that was essential for preserving food and was traded across vast distances. The Latin word for salt is sal. The payment became salarium, and salarium became salary. Every time someone asks you about your salary, they're using a word that was born in the moment a Roman legionary reached out his hand for his ration of salt 2,000 years ago. Or think about disaster. It comes from the Latin dis, meaning ill or bad, and astrum, meaning star. A disaster was literally a bad star, an unlucky alignment of the heavens. The Romans, like most ancient peoples, believed that the movements of celestial bodies influenced earthly events. When something terrible happened, you looked up at the sky and saw a bad star at the wrong angle. That belief is gone. The word is permanent. We speak in the fossil thoughts of a civilization that no longer exists. And I want to stay with that idea for a moment because it matters. Language is not just a tool for communication. It shapes what is thinkable. If you do not have a word for something, it is extraordinarily difficult to think about it clearly. The Romans gave the Western world an enormous vocabulary of governance, law, moral philosophy, and intellectual life. And in doing so, they made certain kinds of thinking available that had not been available before, or at least not in organized, teachable form. When the American founders sat down to write documents that would define a new nation, they reached, almost reflexively, for Latin. They used words like republic, senate, constitution, veto, referendum, and forum. They quoted Cicero in their letters to each other. They named their writing pseudonyms after Roman statesmen, not because they were showing off, because Roman was the language of serious civic thought, and they were trying to think seriously about civic life. Rome was not the only civilization that thought deeply about justice and governance, but it was the civilization whose language survived in usable form at the moment the Western world needed to articulate its ideals, and so Roman concepts became Western concepts. Roman vocabulary became the vocabulary of democracy itself. That is not a small thing to leave behind. I keep thinking about this image. Cicero, on that road, in his final moments choosing not to run. Eyewitnesses who recorded the account say he actually told his slaves to stop the litter and set it down. He looked at the soldiers who had come to carry out the order, and he gave them a clear line of sight, holding still so the blow could be clean. Whether that story is entirely accurate, we cannot know. But the Romans remembered it that way. They needed it to be that way, the orator dying with the same composed dignity he had brought to his words. The man who had argued all his life that how you said something was as important as what you said, making his exit in silence. The things he wrote survived him by 20 centuries, and they are still, right now, quietly organizing the way you think. We have been walking through the invisible architecture that Rome built around our most ordinary moments, the calendar, the wedding, the language in our minds. But there is a layer of Roman inheritance that operates even more quietly, one so embedded that we rarely pause to notice it at all. It does not live in the words you speak or the ceremonies you observe. It lives in the courtroom, in the property deed, in the contract you signed without reading, in the legal principle that, if you are charged with something in this country, you begin your story from a place of innocence. That idea, that foundational civilization-defining idea about how the state should treat its citizens, has a Roman address, and that is exactly where we are going next. Let me ask you something that might sound like a simple question, but stay with it for a moment. If someone accused you of something right now today, something serious, something that could change your life, what would happen first? They would have to prove it. Not you. Them. You would walk into that courtroom or that hearing room or even just that uncomfortable conversation with HR, and the invisible ground beneath your feet would already be tilted in your favor. You would be by default innocent. The person making the accusation would carry every ounce of the burden. If they could not meet that burden, if the evidence was thin or the witnesses were unreliable, or the story just did not hold together, you would walk away. Not because you proved your innocence, simply because they failed to prove your guilt. That is not a small thing. In the full sweep of human history, that is actually an extraordinary thing, and it has a Roman address. The Latin phrase is "e incumbit probatio qui dicit non qui negat." It means roughly the burden of proof rests on whoever makes the claim, not on the one who denies it. The Romans recorded this principle. They argued about it. They enshrined it imperfectly with all the contradictions and class biases that Roman society carried, but they articulated it at a time when most of the ancient world operated on a very different assumption, that if someone powerful enough pointed at you and said, "Guilty," the burden fell on you to prove otherwise. Consider what that world looked like without this principle. In the Middle Ages in Europe, centuries after Rome had fallen, a person accused of a crime might be subjected to what was called trial by ordeal. The theory was roughly as follows: God knows who is guilty. Therefore, if we place this person's hand in boiling water, or make them carry a red-hot iron for 3 paces, or throw them into a river, the Almighty will intervene to protect the innocent. If the wound heals quickly, innocent. If you drown well, innocent, but inconveniently so. The presumption was guilt. The defendant bore the burden of miraculous intervention. One of the sharpest critiques of this system came from the English jurist William Blackstone in the 18th century, who wrote that pronouncing a man guilty unless he was cleared by a miracle was both foolish and unjust. But the concept he was defending, that it is better for guilty people to go free than for innocent people to suffer wrongly, was not a new idea at all. Emperor Trajan of Rome, ruling in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries after the birth of Christ, had already expressed the same moral logic, that it is preferable for a guilty person's crime to go unpunished than for an innocent person to be condemned. The Romans could not always live up to that principle. No civilization has ever fully lived up to its best ideals, but they named it, formalized it, and argued about it with a seriousness that left a traceable line through history all the way to every courtroom in the Western world today. There is a specific moment in Roman legal history that I keep coming back to because it captures the idea so perfectly in the form of a single exchange. A Roman governor named Numerius was on trial before the Emperor Julian in the 4th century after the birth of Christ. His accuser, a man named Elphidius, could see that the evidence was not strong enough. He could see that Numerius was going to be acquitted. And so, in what I can only describe as the ancient world's version of a frustrated prosecutor, complaining to the media, Elphidius turned to the emperor and said, "O illustrious Caesar, if it is sufficient to deny what will become of the guilty," and Julian replied, "If it suffices to accuse what will become of the innocent." That exchange was recorded. It survived, and it contains in 14 words of reply the entire moral architecture of presumption of innocence. What will become of the innocent if accusation alone is enough? That question is still being asked in courtrooms today. It is still being debated in hearings and appeals and Supreme Court decisions. The language has changed. The wigs and togas are mostly gone. But the question Julian's question never went away. Now I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is more interesting than a clean story. The Romans did not invent the presumption of innocence in the way that you invent a tool or a machine complete functional ready to use. Their legal system was full of contradictions. Slaves had almost no legal standing. Women could not act as advocates. Class status profoundly shaped legal outcomes. The wealthy could access skilled advocates and social connections that the poor could not. Torture was used to extract confessions from lower-class defendants. The system was nowhere near equal, and it would be dishonest to present it as a pristine model of justice. But here is what the Romans did that mattered: they argued about it. In writing, in public, in texts that could be copied and carried forward. When a Roman jurist wrote down the principle that the burden of proof belongs to the one making the accusation, even if that principle was not consistently applied, he was creating a target for future generations to aim at. The existence of the written ideal created the possibility of demanding that reality catch up to it. You cannot hold a civilization accountable to a standard that was never articulated. The Romans articulated it, and the thread from that articulation runs directly through Justinian's great compilation of Roman law in the 6th century through medieval canon lawyers who debated these principles in their universities, through the Magna Carta, through the English common law, through William Blackstone, and all the way into the 5th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution, right into the rights you hold today without thinking about them. But the Romans did not just give the world the presumption of innocence. They gave the world something even more foundational, the idea that law itself should be written down, made public, and applied consistently, not kept as secret knowledge wielded by priests and aristocrats. This sounds so obvious to us now that it barely registers as an idea at all. Of course the law should be written down. Of course it should be public. Of course everyone should be able to read what the rules are and hold officials accountable for following them. But in the ancient world this was genuinely radical. The story goes back to around 450 years before the birth of Christ, when Rome was still a relatively young republic, and ordinary citizens, the plebeians, were deeply frustrated. The law as it existed was largely unwritten. It lived in the memories of the patrician class, the old aristocratic families who controlled the courts and the magistracies. If you were a plebeian and you got into a legal dispute with a patrician, you had essentially no way of knowing what the law said. You had to rely on the patrician official to tell you accurately, honestly, fairly what the rules were. You can imagine how that went. The plebeians demanded something radical: write the laws down, put them where everyone can see them, make them legible and permanent. After years of agitation, the Roman Senate sent a delegation to study the legal codes of Greek cities, and then appointed a commission of 10 men, the decemvirs, to write Rome's laws in a form that anyone could read. The result was the 12 tables, 12 bronze tablets displayed publicly in the Roman Forum containing the basic law of Rome: property rights, family relations procedures, for court cases, rules about debt and inheritance. For the first time in Rome's history, anyone who could read could walk up to those tablets and see with their own eyes what the law actually said. The tablets themselves were destroyed centuries later when Rome was sacked by the Gauls. But the principle they established, that law must be transparent, public, and consistently applied, survived and eventually became one of the most powerful ideas in Western civilization. Think about what this means in practical terms. Every time you look up your rights, every time you hold an official accountable to a written rule, every time a judge cites a precedent, a lawyer reads the statute, a journalist reports that a law was broken, all of that rests on the foundation that those plebeians demanded in 450 years before the birth of Christ. Public law, visible law, law that belongs to everyone, not just to those who already hold power. And there is one more piece of Roman legal inheritance I want to tell you about, because this one is so woven into daily life that even lawyers tend to forget where it came from. If you own a home, if you have ever bought or sold property, you have a deed, a legal document that records your ownership. That deed establishes something the law calls title, a clear, defensible, documented right to the property, that protects you against anyone who might challenge your claim. The concept behind that deed is Roman. It is called dominium, absolute ownership, and it was a genuinely revolutionary legal idea before Rome formalized it. Most ancient legal systems operated on something closer to what we might call relative possession, meaning you had a right to use land, but the strongest form of ownership was really just being the person most able to defend your possession of it. Might in practice determined right. There was no clean, formal documented ownership that could be asserted independently of physical occupation and social power. Roman law changed this. It developed the concept that a person could own something absolutely with a legal claim that existed independently of whether they were physically present independently of whether they were currently powerful enough to defend it by force. If you had dominium, you had the right to retrieve property that has been taken from you through a legal process called revindicatio, a lawsuit for recovery of ownership. Your legal right was separate from your physical possession. From that concept flows everything: the property deed, the title, search, the mortgage, the lease agreement, the will that transfers property after death. If you own a home with a deed, or if you have a lease on an apartment, you're participating in a framework of documented, protected ownership that the Romans invented for their citizens more than 2,000 years ago. And here is the detail that I find oddly moving: when a Roman transferred property formally, they did not just hand it over. There was a ceremony involving the presence of witnesses, the use of a scale and specific words that had to be spoken correctly. The formality was not theatre, it was designed to make the transfer real, witnessed and undeniable, to make the right permanent and public. Your closing documents, with their pages of signatures and witness attestations and notarized seals, are not so different. The scale is gone. The ritual words are now printed on legal forms, but the underlying logic that the transfer of property must be formal, witnessed and recorded to be legally real is the same logic that Roman citizens were following in the 2nd century before the birth of Christ. What I want you to hold on to from all of this is not just a collection of interesting facts about Rome. It is something a little more unsettling than that. Every legal protection you hold as an individual in a modern Western democracy, the presumption that you are innocent, the right to see the charges against you in writing, the right to be heard before you can be condemned, the ability to own something in a way that cannot simply be taken from you without legal process. None of these protections are obvious. None of them are natural. They are not written into the human heart. They had to be fought for, articulated, formalized, defended, and transmitted over generations. The Romans fought for some of them. The medieval scholars who read Roman texts transmitted them. The English common law refined them. The American founders codified them, and now they live inside systems so established that most people never think about where they came from or how fragile they might be without the centuries of effort that built them. There is something both comforting and sobering in that. The protections feel permanent because they have been around so long, but they were not permanent when they were young. Someone had to stand up in a Roman forum or scratch words onto a bronze tablet or reply to an accuser with 14 devastating words to make them real. Real things began as fragile ideas. We've travelled a long way tonight through time, through ceremony, through language, through law. But there is one layer of Roman influence that I've not yet touched on, one that operates not in the laws that govern you or the words you speak, but in the physical structure of every city you have ever walked through. The width of the road under your feet, the grid of streets that surrounds you, the reason certain cities grew where they did and were built the way they were. Because when the Romans went somewhere, they did not just pass through. They organized the land itself. And that organization is still there, still shaping the geography of the modern world, whether anyone notices it or not. Somewhere right now, in a city you might know well, there are 2 streets running at perfect right angles to each other. One goes north to south, one goes east to west. Where they meet, there is probably a public square, or a town hall, or a courthouse, or some other structure that signals this is the centre. This is where things matter. You've walked through that intersection 100 times. You've parked near it, grabbed coffee near it, complained about the traffic near it. You probably never gave it a second thought, but that intersection, the very fact that those two streets meet at right angles, that the centre of the town is where it is, that the whole surrounding grid was laid out in that particular way, that was a deliberate choice. A choice made by Roman military engineers who perfected a system for organizing space over 2,000 years ago and then stamped it onto the landscape of an entire civilization. The grid is not just a convenient way to organize a city, it is a Roman way to organize a city, and it is nearly everywhere. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story because it starts not in a city at all, but in a field. When a Roman legion arrived in a new territory, one of the first things they did, before anything else, before building fortifications, before establishing supply lines, was set up camp. And the camp was not a chaotic cluster of tents thrown down wherever the soldiers could find space. It was a precisely designed, standardized, immediately recognizable layout that every Roman soldier in the empire would have known by heart. They called it a castra, and it looked the same whether you were in Britain or in North Africa or in what is now Syria. The engineers would begin by marking two main roads. One ran from north to south through the centre of the camp, the Cardo Maximus meaning roughly the central hinge. The other ran east to west, the Decumanus Maximus meaning the main division. These two roads crossed at the exact centre of the camp, forming a perfect intersection. From that intersection, a grid extended outward in all directions, dividing the camp into clean rectangular blocks. The headquarters was placed at the centre, nearest the intersection. The soldiers' barracks fanned out in an orderly pattern from there. The gates were positioned at the ends of each main road. Why this level of standardization? Because familiarity meant speed. A Roman soldier arriving at a new camp in the middle of the night, exhausted from marching, in a country whose language he did not speak, could still find his way around without asking anyone for directions. The layout was always the same. His barracks were always in the same relative position. The headquarters was always at the intersection. There was comfort in that consistency, and military efficiency too. But here is the thing about the castra that matters for us, tonight, right now. Wherever the Roman army set up a permanent or semi-permanent camp, civilians followed. Local traders set up shop just outside the walls. Families of soldiers came, merchants arrived, and what began as a military camp slowly over years became a town, and the town kept the shape of the camp. The Cardo and the Decumanus stayed. The grid remained. The intersection at the centre became the forum, the civic square, the marketplace, the place of public life. And the Roman town that grew up around that original military layout carried the geometry of the castra forward into civilian existence. Now here is where this becomes personal in a way that I think might genuinely surprise you. If you live in or have visited London, the ancient core of that city, the oldest part, follows a Roman grid. The Romans called it Londinium, and they established it around 43 years after the birth of Christ. London Wall, the boundary of the original Roman city, still roughly defines the limits of what Londoners call the square mile. The street patterns that survive from the ancient settlement still influence how people move through that part of the city today. Paris was Lutetia, a Roman settlement on the Ile de la Cité, the island in the Seine. Vienna was Vindobona, a Roman legionary fortress whose grid left its mark on the medieval and modern city that grew from it. Cologne was Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, and the Roman street grid beneath it is still partially traceable in the modern street map. York in England was Eboracum, another legionary fortress. The characteristic rectangular outline of the old town, the way certain streets still run at right angles in a pattern that seems overly deliberate compared to the organic growth around it, is a direct inheritance from the Roman camp that sat there 2,000 years ago. And in America, no Roman soldier ever marched on American soil. But the idea, the template, travelled across the Atlantic with European colonizers who'd grown up in cities shaped by Roman urban planning, who had studied Roman texts on engineering and city design, and who applied those principles to the new towns they built. The grid plan of American cities, the numbered streets and lettered avenues that make navigation so logical in places like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver, is a philosophical inheritance. Not direct, not unbroken, but traceable back through European urban planning to the Roman military engineers who first made the grid systematic and exportable. Do you want a specific number that will make this concrete? In the year 1785, the Continental Congress passed something called the Land Ordinance, which established a system for surveying and organizing the territory of the new nation using a strict rectangular grid. The entire American Midwest was divided into square townships and sections before anyone even settled it. The landscape organized on paper, in advance, according to a geometric logic that whispers of the Roman castra. The grid existed before the cities. The shape came before the life that filled it. But let me tell you about something even more remarkable: the roads themselves. Because it is one thing to say that Roman roads influenced later infrastructure. It is another to understand what Roman roads actually were and to grasp why, 2,000 years later, some of them are still in use. At its peak, the Roman road network covered approximately 80,000 kilometers of hard-surfaced highway. To give you a sense of the scale, if you drove those roads back to back, without sleeping, without stopping, at highway speed, it would take you over 3 months. This network stretched from the northern coast of Britain, across Europe, through the Middle East, down into North Africa, from the Scottish border to the edge of the Sahara, all connected by roads built to a standard that, frankly, was not consistently matched in the Western world until the 19th century. And the way they built them, this is the part that I find almost absurdly impressive. A Roman road was not a layer of paving on top of dirt. It was an engineered structure, built in layers from the ground up, with attention to drainage, load-bearing capacity, and long-term stability that modern civil engineers still point to as a model. The engineers first surveyed the route using a tool called a groma, essentially a sighting instrument for establishing straight lines. They preferred straight roads because straight roads are shorter roads, and shorter roads require less material and less maintenance. When something blocked the path, a hill, a river, a marsh, the Roman approach was almost always to go through it, or over it, not around it. They cut through hills, they built bridges over rivers, they drained marshes, they constructed viaducts across valleys. The geography was expected to yield to the road, not the other way around. Then the actual construction began. A trench was excavated. Into that trench went a foundation layer of large stones or rubble. Above that, a layer of smaller stones mixed with mortar. Above that, a layer of fine gravel, compressed and levelled. And on top, the surface layer, large polygonal stone slabs, cut and fitted to sit flush against each other, slightly cambered in the middle so that rainwater would run off to the drainage ditches on either side rather than pooling on the surface. The entire structure could be up to 1.5 meters thick. It was built not just to carry foot traffic and the occasional cart, but to support the relentless passage of armies, thousands of soldiers and their baggage trains, their siege equipment, their supply wagons, year after year, decade after decade without deteriorating. And they did not deteriorate. Many of them lasted 800 years of continuous use under the Roman Empire, and some, in various degrees of preservation, are still there today. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, begun in 312 years before the birth of Christ, still exists. You can walk on the original stone surface south of Rome. You're walking on road surface that is over 2,300 years old. Let that sit for a moment. 2,300 years old, still there. The early Christian missionaries who spread across Europe in the first few centuries after the birth of Christ did so along Roman roads. The word of Christianity travelled on Roman infrastructure, medieval pilgrims making their way to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela, to Jerusalem. They walked on Roman roads, stayed in the way stations that the Romans had set up at intervals of roughly 25 to 30 kilometres. Medieval merchants moved goods along Roman routes because those routes were the best maintained paths through the landscape. Even when the Roman Empire in the West collapsed in the late 5th century, the roads outlasted the civilization that built them. The civilization died, the roads remained, and future civilizations built on top of them, sometimes literally. The foundations of modern European highways in places like France, Spain, and Britain often rest on Roman roadbeds. There is a modern road in England called the Fosse Way. It runs for around 300 kilometres through the English countryside. It still follows, with remarkable precision, the line of the Roman road that was built along the same route roughly 2,000 years ago. Cars drive along the Fosse Way today. The route has been continuously in use, in some form, for 20 centuries. You occasionally hear people say that something was built to last. Usually they mean something that will hold up for 20 or 30 years before needing major work. The Romans built to last for millennia, and a remarkable amount of what they built has actually lasted that long. Now I want to pause here and ask you something that I think is worth genuinely sitting with. When the Romans built a road, they were doing something purely practical. They wanted to move armies efficiently. They wanted to control territory. They wanted to extract taxes and transport goods and send messages. The road was a tool of power, and yet what happened when they built those roads, the unintended, impossible to plan for consequence, was that they created the connective tissue of a civilization. Along those roads moved not just soldiers and tax collectors, but merchants and missionaries, philosophers and poets, artists and engineers. Ideas travelled on Roman roads. Languages blended where Roman roads brought communities into contact with each other. The Latin language spread along those roads and eventually became the root of French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, all 5 of which are still spoken today by hundreds of millions of people. The road built for military control became the highway of cultural exchange. That is an extraordinary historical irony, and it is one of my favourite examples of how the most consequential things in history are often not what the people who built them intended. Have you ever had that experience, where you built something for one reason and it turned out to matter for a completely different one? The Romans had that experience on a civilizational scale. There is one more detail about Roman roads that I want to share with you, because it lives in your daily life in a way you almost certainly have never noticed. The word mile comes from the Latin milia passuum, meaning 1,000 paces. A Roman pace was not a single step but a double step. Right foot, left foot, back to right. 1,000 of those double paces equalled approximately 1,476 metres, or roughly what we would call a mile today. Roman soldiers counted their paces obsessively. Every 1,000 double steps, a milestone was planted, a stone column on the side of the road, marked with numbers indicating the distance from Rome. In the Forum of Rome stood the Golden Milestone, a gilded bronze column from which, notionally, All distances in the empire were measured. When someone said, "All roads lead to Rome," they meant it almost literally. Every milestone in the empire pointed back to that golden column. The Roman mile was abolished with the Roman Empire, but the word stayed, adapted into Old English as mill, persisting through the centuries and becoming the mile that you use today when you check the distance to the next exit on the highway. Every time you talk about miles per hour, you're using a unit of measurement that a Roman soldier invented by counting his footsteps on roads that are still, in some places, beneath the roads you drive on now. I love this particular trail of inheritance. Calendar, ceremony, language, law, city, road. Because each one shows a different face of the same truth. That the Romans were not just building an empire, they were building a framework. A way of organizing time, relationships, words, rights, space, and movement that was robust enough and useful enough to survive the empire itself by 2,000 years and counting. We walk inside their framework without knowing it. We drive on their roads, live in the grid of their camps, use their measurements, and then go home and sign legal documents written on their principles and argue with our partners about whether a June wedding is better, without ever once tracing the thread back to where it started. But if the Romans left their mark on the roads beneath your feet and the laws above your head, there is still one domain we have not explored, one that might be the most intimate of all. Because it turns out that the Romans also had very specific ideas about how civilization should feed itself, about the spectacle of abundance, the politics of the meal, and the calculated use of entertainment to keep people from asking too many uncomfortable questions. And that story, about bread, circuses, and the mechanics of keeping a population content, feels, if you ask me, uncomfortably relevant to the world we're living in right now. Close your eyes for a second. Well, not literally since you're watching, but just imagine this. You are sitting in a stadium that holds 50,000 people. It is free to get in. The food stalls outside are subsidized by the government. The screen above the arena is enormous. The show is spectacular. And somewhere in the best seat, clearly visible to everyone, sits the most powerful person in the country, watching alongside you, publicly delighting in the same entertainment, making a point of being seen as a man of the people. Now, are you picturing an ancient Roman amphitheatre, or are you picturing something a little more contemporary? If you hesitated for even a moment, that hesitation is the whole point of what we're about to talk about. The Romans had a phrase for it. 2 words, really. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. And those 2 words, written by a satirical poet named Juvenal around 100 years after the birth of Christ, have turned out to be one of the most devastating and enduringly accurate descriptions of political power ever committed to writing. Juvenal was furious when he wrote them, not at the emperors, or not only at the emperors, but at the Roman people themselves. He was watching a civilization that had once prided itself on civic engagement, on the active participation of its citizens in the great project of self-governance, and he was watching it trade all of that away, not for security, not under threat, but voluntarily, for the convenience of free grain and the excitement of the arena. He wrote, roughly translated, "Already long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties. For the people who once handed out military command, high office, legions, everything, now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just 2 things, bread and circuses. Anxiously hopes for just 2 things, bread and circuses." There is something in that word anxiously that I keep coming back to, not contentedly, not lazily, anxiously. As if even the Romans who had accepted this bargain somehow knew, in a quiet corner of themselves, that they had given something up, that there was a version of their lives, a more demanding, more engaged, more alive version, that they had traded away for comfort and spectacle. And that knowledge sat with them uneasily, even as they cheered in the arena. So let's go back to the beginning of this story, because the bread came first, and it started not as a tool of manipulation, but as an act of political desperation. In 123 years before the birth of Christ, a Roman politician named Gaius Sempronius Gracchus was facing a crisis. Rome had been absorbing conquered territory for a century, and the wealth flowing into the city had created an enormous and growing problem. Massive numbers of poor urban citizens who'd been displaced from their farms had migrated to Rome looking for work, had found some work but not enough, and were now living in tenement buildings, several families to a floor, permanently one bad harvest away from starvation. Gracchus proposed a solution. The state would subsidize grain and sell it to citizens at below-market prices. It was a welfare policy, essentially, and like most welfare policies, it was immediately controversial. The wealthy called it bribe, the poor called it justice. The political class saw it for what it was, a mechanism for winning loyalty. The grain dole, called the annona, meaning the yearly provisions, grew over the following century from subsidized grain into free grain. By the time Julius Caesar came to power, roughly 320,000 citizens of Rome were receiving free grain every month. The city's population was probably around 1 million at that point, so roughly a third of the capital was being fed, at least partially, by state distribution. And here is what never gets enough attention. By the reign of the Emperor Augustus, the administration required to manage this grain supply, to import wheat from Egypt and Sicily and North Africa, to store it in massive warehouses along the Tiber, to distribute it through 45 distribution points around the city, was enormous. It was, in effect, an early version of a national logistics operation. Rome had a designated official called the prefect of the grain supply, whose job was essentially to keep the capital fed, and who wielded extraordinary power because the consequences of failure were so catastrophic. Tiberius, the second emperor, is recorded as saying that if the grain supply was ever neglected, it would be the utter ruin of the state. He was right. The people knew it. The emperors knew it. Everyone understood that the man who controlled the bread controlled Rome. But bread alone was not enough, and this is where the circus comes in. And I am not talking about clowns and acrobats, though the word does derive from the Latin for a circular or oval track. In Rome, the circus referred to a whole universe of public entertainment. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus, theatrical performances, animal hunts, and, most spectacularly, the gladiatorial games that became the defining cultural export of the Roman Empire. And it was in the construction of the Colosseum in the late 1st century after the birth of Christ that the Romans built what is arguably the most impressive and calculated political instrument ever constructed out of stone. Let me tell you about the Colosseum, because most of what you think you know about it is slightly wrong, and the truth is more interesting. Construction began around 72 years after the birth of Christ, under the Emperor Vespasian. It was completed in 80 years after the birth of Christ by his son Titus, and a fourth story was added by the next emperor, Domitian, 2 years after that. The building is an ellipse approximately 189 meters long and 156 meters wide. It stands roughly 50 meters tall. It was built of travertine limestone, volcanic rock, and Roman concrete, a material so durable that some of the original concrete survives in structural use today. At its peak, it held somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. To put that in modern terms, that is roughly the capacity of the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum or Wembley Stadium. in the first century after the birth of Christ. Admission was free, not discounted, not subsidized, free for everyone. The emperor paid, and here is the detail that makes the political logic of the whole enterprise crystal clear. It was funded, at least in part, with the plunder from the Roman sack of Jerusalem in 70 years after the birth of Christ. An inscription at the site confirms that Vespasian ordered the construction from his share of the spoils of war. The conquered paid for the circus of the conquerors, and the conquerors were entertained for free. When it opened, Titus presided over 100 consecutive days of games. 100 days. Imagine a Super Bowl that ran for a third of a year, continuously, at the emperor's expense. Can I tell you what the day at the Colosseum actually looked like? Because I think the structure of it is revealing in a way that the highlight reel version never captures. A typical day of games was divided into 3 sections. The morning was dedicated to the venatio, animal hunts. Exotic animals from across the empire were brought in. Lions from North Africa, tigers from Persia, bears from Britain, elephants, ostriches, hippopotamuses. Trained hunters would engage them. Sometimes the hunting was reversed and the animals would stalk the hunters. The crowd apparently had complicated feelings about this. Accounts suggest that Roman audiences sometimes cheered for the animals, especially when a lion turned the tables on a hunter who had grown overconfident. The midday session was for executions. Condemned criminals were led into the arena and dispatched in elaborate and theatrical ways, sometimes dressed as characters from Roman mythology, sometimes simply thrown to animals. This was not considered entertainment by most of the educated class. Roman writers generally found it in poor taste, but the crowd who stayed through lunch seemed to enjoy it. And then the afternoon belonged to the gladiators. This is where the real artistry came in, and I use that word deliberately. Gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum was not chaotic street violence. It was structured, regulated, and carefully choreographed for maximum dramatic impact. Gladiators were divided into types: the heavily armoured fighter against the lightly armed net wielder, the sword specialist against the shield expert, pairings designed to create visual contrast and tactical suspense. There were referees, there were doctors standing by. Fights did not necessarily end in someone's death. The crowd could vote to spare a defeated fighter, and often did, especially if he had shown skill and courage. Successful gladiators became genuine celebrities. They had fans. They had fan clubs, essentially. Their names were written on walls around the city. Their graffiti scratched into Pompeian walls that read, translated roughly, Celadus the Thracian, the girl's dream. Real people with real reputations who walked through these gates and did their work in front of 50,000 people who'd been fed by the state and were now being entertained by it. And the seating arrangement inside the Colosseum, this is where the political genius of the whole project becomes almost uncomfortably clear. The emperor and his immediate circle sat at the very front, ringside, closest to the action. Above them, the senatorial class. Above that, the equestrian order, wealthy merchants and military veterans, and in the upper tiers the nosebleed seats sat everyone else. Ordinary citizens, women, foreigners, freed enslaved people. Now at first glance this looks like ordinary class stratification. Of course the rich sit closer to the stage. We know this. We still do this. Premium seats at a concert cost more than the upper deck, but there is a crucial difference in what the Romans were doing. The entire population, rich and poor, senator and street vendor, was being gathered into the same building and directed to watch the same spectacle, with the emperor visible to all of them, presiding over the whole event, his generosity on display, his power on show. The hierarchy was reinforced, yes, but so was the sense of community. So was the idea that this emperor, this powerful man, had chosen to spend his personal wealth, at least in theory, giving his people a gift. The crowd in the Colosseum was not passive. They made noise. They voted on whether gladiators lived or died by waving their handkerchiefs or turning their thumbs. The emperor generally followed the crowd's verdict, at least in public, because appearing to listen to the people, even if you had no intention of actually doing so in matters of governance, was the whole point. It was theatre, magnificent, expensive, highly orchestrated political theatre, and it worked for centuries. The satirist Juvenal saw through it. That is why his 2 words have survived 2,000 years. But I want to gently push back on the implied cynicism for just a moment, not to excuse what the emperors were doing, but to complicate it. The people receiving free grain in Rome were mostly not lazy citizens who had decided to stop caring about civic life. Many of them were displaced farmers, craftsmen who had lost their livelihoods to the economic disruptions of empire, veterans who had served their time and come home to nothing. The grain dole kept them alive. That is not nothing. That is not merely manipulation. There was a genuine social need being met, even if the political motives behind meeting it were complicated. And the Colosseum, for all the moral horror of what happened in it, and I'm not minimizing that, also served real social functions. It was one of the few places in Roman life where tens of thousands of people from radically different social backgrounds gathered in the same space, shared an experience, and were reminded that they were all part of something larger than themselves. Community, even manufactured community, even community engineered by an autocrat for political purposes, has real psychological value for the people experiencing it. The problem was not that the people wanted food and wanted entertainment. The problem, as Juvenal saw it, was that the political class had discovered that providing food and entertainment was cheaper than providing justice, equality, and meaningful participation in government. And once that discovery was made, there was a strong incentive to keep making it. Here is the question I cannot stop asking, and I'm going to put it to you directly. What are our circuses? Sit with that. Not accusatorially. I'm not trying to make you feel bad for watching football or scrolling through your phone. But genuinely, what are the spectacles that fill the hours that might otherwise be spent asking harder questions? What is the free content that keeps us engaged, stimulated, and too entertained to be particularly outraged? The Romans asked this question. Juvenal asked it. And he was ignored largely because the bread was good and the games were exciting. I am not drawing a one-to-one equivalence between the ancient world and ours. History is not a template, and the differences are as real as the similarities. But I do think there is something genuinely uncomfortable in the fact that a phrase invented 2,000 years ago to describe a specific political strategy, keep them fed and keep them entertained, still works as a description of dynamics we recognize in our own moment, without even having to strain to see them. The Romans are gone, the formula endures, and yet, and I want to end this stretch on something that feels more hopeful, the very fact that Juvenal wrote those words and that they survived suggests something important. Every era produces people who refuse the bargain, who notice what is being traded, who put words to the pattern so that future generations, reading in some other century in some other language, can recognize it when they see it. The Romans gave us the formula. They also gave us the critique of the formula. Both have survived. Which one we choose to use is perhaps the most consequential Roman inheritance of all. Speaking of inheritance, there is one more layer to the Roman legacy that I've been saving, because in some ways it is the most personal of everything we have covered. Not the laws above your head, not the roads beneath your feet, not the bread and circuses that occupy your attention, but the water in your cup, the pipe in your wall. the invisible assumption so fundamental that it barely registers as an idea at all, that fresh water should flow to wherever people live. That clean water is something a city owes its citizens, not a luxury they must earn. That idea has a Roman address too, and the engineering that carried it is still in places delivering water today. That is where we're going next. There is a fountain in Rome that tourists visit by the millions every year. You've almost certainly seen photographs of it, even if you have never stood before it yourself. People throw coins into it and make wishes. It is dramatic, baroque, overwhelming. A cascade of sculpted gods and sea creatures and horses tumbling over each other in stone, water erupting from every surface. It is called the Trevi Fountain, and the water flowing through it right now, at this very moment, is being carried by an ancient Roman aqueduct that was built in 19 years before the birth of Christ. Not an aqueduct that was inspired by a Roman one, not a modern pipe running along an ancient route. The actual aqueduct, the Aqua Virgo, built under the order of Marcus Agrippa during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. Restored and modified over the centuries by a pope in the 8th century, by another in the 15th, by engineers in the 20th. But fundamentally the same channel, following fundamentally the same path, delivering water to Rome as it has done for more than 2,000 years. Every coin you toss into that fountain is carried on water that has been flowing continuously since before the birth of Christianity. That fact rearranges something in my brain every time I think about it. Not ruins, not a museum piece, a working piece of infrastructure still doing its job after 2 millennia, because the Romans built it so well and because every subsequent civilization that inherited it was wise enough to maintain rather than replace it. But to really understand what the Romans achieved with water, you have to go back to the beginning, to the year 312 years before the birth of Christ, when Rome built its first aqueduct. The city had been relying on the Tiber River, on springs and on shallow wells. This worked when Rome was small, but by the early 4th century before the birth of Christ, Rome had grown into a genuine city, crowded, bustling, constantly demanding more of everything, including water. The Tiber was increasingly polluted by the activity of a growing population. The wells were inadequate, springs close to the city were running low, and there was a deeper problem. Water drawn from sources near a densely populated area tends to be contaminated by the very people who drink it. So the Roman census officer, the censor, Appius Claudius Caecus, had what was, for its time, a genuinely audacious idea. Rather than trying to improve the water sources near the city, he would bring water to the city from far away. From clean springs in the hills outside Rome, elevated above the city where the water was pure and uncontaminated, he would build a channel, miles long, carved through hills and supported over valleys, that would carry that clean water to Rome using nothing more than gravity. The aqueduct was called the Aqua Appia, after its builder. It ran for about 16 kilometers, mostly underground, bringing water from springs east of the city to a fountain near the cattle market in the center of Rome. By the standards of what came later, it was modest. But it established something that would change the Roman world permanently. The idea that a city's water supply does not have to be limited by what nature provides at that location. That engineering can bridge the gap between where clean water exists and where people need it. Once that idea was established, there was no stopping it. Over the next 6 centuries, Rome built 10 more major aqueducts, each one longer, higher, and more ambitious than the last. The Aqua Marcia, built around 144 years before the birth of Christ, brought water from springs 61 kilometers away in the hills. It was considered the purest and coldest water in Rome, and it arrived high enough on its arches to reach the Capitoline Hill at the center of the city. something no previous aqueduct had managed. The Aqua Claudia, completed in 52 years after the birth of Christ under the Emperor Claudius, was even longer, nearly 70 kilometers from source to city, and ran on arched supports for the last 15 kilometers of its journey, its massive stone piers still visible marching across the Roman countryside today, 2,000 years later, as solid as the day they were built. By the late 1st century after the birth of Christ, when an official named Sextus Julius Frontinus was appointed as Rome's water commissioner under the Emperor Nerva, the city had 9 major aqueducts in operation. Frontinus was a former general and consul, a man who had governed Britain, commanded armies on the Danube frontier, and held some of the most powerful offices in the Roman state. Being given the water portfolio was not considered a demotion. Water was that important. Frontinus did something that strikes me as deeply admirable and somewhat underrated in the history of public administration. When he took the job, he did not accept the briefings from the previous administration at face value. He went out and measured things himself. He surveyed the aqueducts. He hired engineers to map the system. He calculated the actual flow from each source and compared it to what the records claimed was flowing. And what he found was deeply inconvenient for everyone who had been running the system before him. Roughly 40% of the water that was supposed to be flowing to the city was not reaching the city. It was being stolen, not disappearing into leaks, though some of it was, being actively, deliberately stolen by the workers who maintained the aqueducts, who had been quietly diverting water into pipes that ran to their friends' houses, or sold access to illegal hookups, by farmers whose land bordered the aqueduct channels, who had tapped into them to irrigate their fields during the growing season, by wealthy private citizens who had bribed the water bureaucracy into quietly increasing their allocation beyond their legal entitlement. Frontinus wrote all of this down. He produced a report for the emperor that is one of the most remarkable administrative documents of the ancient world, scrupulously honest, technically precise, and remarkable for its absence of cover-up or spin. He described exactly what had gone wrong, exactly who was responsible, and exactly what he intended to do about it. He called it De Aquaductu Urbis Romae, on the water supply of the city of Rome, and the reforms he implemented, stricter monitoring, regular inspection, accountability for maintenance workers, roughly doubled the effective water supply reaching the city's residents without building a single new aqueduct. Frontinus was, in other words, doing what we might today call an audit. He was the first recorded water commissioner in history to treat the water supply as a public accountability issue rather than a technical engineering one. The distinction matters enormously, and it still does. Now pause and let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are almost impossible to believe. At its peak, Rome's aqueduct system was delivering somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million cubic meters of water into the city every single day. For a population estimated at around 1 million people, that works out to somewhere between 500 and 1,000 litres of water per person per day. The average American today uses roughly 380 litres of water per person per day, for everything: drinking, bathing, flushing toilets, doing laundry, washing cars, watering gardens. Rome was delivering at minimum more than that per person, in a city with a population of 1 million in the 1st century after the birth of Christ, using only gravity and stone. It was not matched again in the Western world, in terms of per capita urban water delivery, until the 19th century. Nearly 1,800 years elapsed between the peak of Roman water engineering and the moment when any other city in Europe achieved comparable levels of supply. What happened to the Roman water system when the empire collapsed in the West in the late 5th century is one of the more poignant engineering stories in history. The aqueducts did not fail because the engineering gave out. They failed because the people responsible for maintaining them stopped maintaining them. As Roman administrative structure disintegrated, as the funds and the skilled engineers and the organizational capacity of the state gradually withdrew, the aqueducts, which required continuous skilled maintenance to function, began to deteriorate. Calcium deposits built up in the channels, sections of conduit cracked, arches were quarried for stone by medieval builders who needed the material for something else. By the 8th century after the birth of Christ, all but one of Rome's aqueducts had stopped flowing. The population of the city, which had been around 1 million at the empire's peak, had collapsed to perhaps 30,000. A city of 1 million people requires a vast water supply. A city of 30,000 can survive on springs and the Tiber. The fall of Rome's water system was not a dramatic event. It was a slow withdrawal, infrastructure failing piece by piece as the institutions that had sustained it crumbled. And the lesson in that, the painful, very relevant lesson, is that engineering marvels do not sustain themselves. They require continuous human will and institutional commitment to maintain. But the Aqua Virgo survived. Just barely, in places. Restored by Pope Adrian I in the 8th century, and then again by Pope Nicholas V in the 15th century, and again, and again, and again. Each restoration breathing new life into channels that Agrippa's engineers had surveyed and built in 19 years before the birth of Christ. And today, when you stand in front of the Trevi fountain and hear the water roaring through the sculpted figures, that water came from the Sabine Hills. It travelled through channels that follow a course planned 2,000 years ago. It has been flowing, in one form or another, without interruption that matters, since before your great-great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents were born. Have you ever been to the Trevi fountain, or seen it in a photograph and felt that pull, that inexplicable sense that this place matters, that it carries something you cannot quite name? Part of what you are feeling, I think, is the weight of all that continuity. The coin goes into water that is old beyond ordinary reckoning. Something in us responds to that, even when we do not know why. There is one more piece of Roman water engineering I want to tell you about, because it is hiding in plain sight in a place that millions of tourists visit every year without ever realizing what they are looking at. The Pont du Gard in southern France. You've probably seen photographs of it. 3 tiers of stone arches rising nearly 50 meters above the Gard River, perfectly proportioned, catching the late afternoon light in a way that makes it look almost too beautiful to be a working structure. It is a bridge, yes, but it is not a road bridge. It is the central span of an aqueduct that carried water nearly 50 kilometers from a spring near the city of Uzes to the Roman city of Nimes, and it did so for roughly 5 centuries. What stops me every time I look at it is the engineering. The entire 50-kilometer journey from source to city dropped in elevation by only 17 meters. 17 meters over 50 kilometers. That is an average gradient of less than 0.4 meters per kilometer, a slope so gentle you could walk the entire route and never feel like you were going downhill at all. Yet it was precisely calibrated to keep the water moving at the right speed, not so fast it eroded the channel walls, not so slow it stagnated. The Roman surveyors who laid this route had no electronic instruments. They used devices called chorobates, essentially very long spirit levels, and gromae, the sighting instruments we talked about earlier in a different context. And with those tools, using only the knowledge of how water moves and where the land lay, they plotted a 50-kilometer course through the French countryside at a gradient of less than 1 part in 3,000. And then they built it, Construction is estimated to have taken about 15 years and employed between 800 and 1,000 workers. The stone for the arch sections was quarried nearby and lifted without any machinery we would recognize, by levers, pulleys, scaffolding, and the organized labor of skilled workers. You can still see on some of the stone blocks the Roman numerals carved by the workers to indicate where each piece belonged in the puzzle. The Pont du Gard has been standing for roughly 2,000 years. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is the most visited ancient monument in France, and it is still structurally sound, still exactly where the Roman engineers put it, still spanning the Gard River with the same arches, still carrying the faint ghost of the channel above that once brought water to Nemus. But here is the thing about Roman water engineering that goes deeper than the engineering itself. It is the idea underneath it. Before Rome, water was something you went to get. You carried it from the river, from the well, from the spring. Access to clean water was determined by proximity and by physical capacity. The wealthy could have servants carry it. The poor carried it themselves or drank what was nearby. The quality varied enormously by location. There was no concept that a city, as such, owed its inhabitants a reliable supply of clean water, regardless of where they lived within it. The Romans changed this not just in practice, but in principle. They created the office of water commissioner, a senior official whose entire job was to ensure that water reached the population. They created laws governing the fair distribution of water, laws that prioritized public fountains over private wealth, that specified who could draw water legally and how much. When Frontinus took over and found the system riddled with corruption, he treated it as a civic scandal, as a violation of the public's right to the water they were owed. That idea, that clean water is a civic responsibility, a right of residence in a city rather than a privilege of wealth or proximity, is an idea we still argue about today. Many parts of the world do not yet have it in practice. Some parts of the developed world are beginning to lose it as infrastructure crumbles under austerity and privatization. The Romans planted the seed of this idea in their administrative practices, in their laws, in the very architecture of 11 aqueducts pointing toward a city of 1 million people. Do you turn on a tap and expect clean water? The expectation is Roman. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that you can still throw a coin into the Trevi fountain and wish for something. Millions of people do it every year. The water receives the coin. The water does not know what you wished for, has no memory of the millions of wishes before yours, carries no record of every hand that has ever tossed hope into it. But the water itself, the water is very old. Older than the fountain, older than the medieval restorations, older than any building in Rome that is still standing except the oldest stones. That water has been moving since Augustus was emperor, since Agrippa built the channel to carry it, since a young girl, so the legend says, led some thirsty Roman soldiers to the spring that would become its source. 2,000 years of continuity, 2,000 years of one human commitment flowing into the next. The engineers who built it, the popes who restored it, the workers who maintained it, the modern city that still uses it, all of them linking hands across time to deliver water to a fountain that millions of people visit to make a wish. I find that, I cannot think of a better word, I find that beautiful, not just as engineering, as a demonstration of what human institutions at their best are capable of sustaining. We have spent the last few stretches of this journey walking through layers of Roman inheritance that are invisible in daily life. Time, ceremony, language, law, the grid of cities, the road beneath your feet, the water in your glass. But there is one inheritance that might be the most counterintuitive of all, because it lives not in something the Romans built, but in something they feared. A deep, centuries-old Roman anxiety about reputation, about what other people think of you, about the social consequences of public shame, that became so embedded in Western culture that you feel it every time you post something online and watch the reaction numbers climb. The Romans called it infamia, and its echoes in the modern world are everywhere, even if nobody uses the Latin word anymore. You know that feeling when you post something, a photo, an opinion, a comment, and then you sit there watching. Not even consciously, but watching. Checking if people responded. Checking if they responded favourably. Feeling something shift inside you depending on what comes back. A small warmth when it goes well. A different, harder feeling when it does not. We tend to think of that as a product of social media, a modern affliction, something that smartphones and algorithms and the attention economy invented. But I want to suggest to you tonight that what you're feeling in those moments is something much, much older than any platform or algorithm. That the anxiety about what other people think of you, the way your social reputation feels like a physical thing, something with weight and substance that can be built or damaged, is one of the oldest features of Western culture, and it has a Roman name. They called it existimatio, the standing you hold in others' estimation, and losing it was called infamia. To understand infamia, you first have to understand that the Romans lived inside a social economy of honour in a way that is genuinely difficult for modern people to fully grasp. Honour, dignitas in Latin, a word that gives us our English word dignity, was not merely a nice thing to have. It was a form of social currency that determined almost everything about what a person could do in Roman life. Dignitas accumulated over a lifetime through military service, through public office, through the faithful fulfillment of duties to family and state, through generous patronage of those below you and loyal service to those above you. It was inherited in part from your family's reputation, which is why ancestral death masks were displayed in Roman homes, and why family lineage was publicly recited at funerals. The dead were watching. Their reputations were your assets, and your behaviour was your family's reputation going forward. Alongside dignitas stood auctoritas, not authority in the sense of power, but authority in the deeper sense of earned moral weight. The kind of respect that causes people to listen to you not because they have to, but because they have decided your judgment is worth following. A Roman senator did not command simply because of his office. He commanded because of the accumulated auctoritas of a lifetime of demonstrated virtue and competent service. And then there was gravitas, seriousness of manner, the quality of treating important things as important, of not being frivolous when the moment demanded weight. A Roman leader without gravitas was almost inconceivable. You could not hold power without it. These three concepts, dignitas, auctoritas, gravitas, formed a kind of invisible architecture of Roman social life, and infamia was what happened when that architecture collapsed. Infamia literally means the absence of fama, the absence of good repute, and it was not simply embarrassment or social awkwardness. It was a formal, legally recognized status that carried real, concrete consequences. A person who became infamis, an infames, could not testify in court, could not run for public office, could not serve as a legal representative for anyone including themselves. In certain cases they could not serve in the military. They were not physically marked, not imprisoned, not publicly flogged, but they were excluded from the mechanisms of civic participation that gave Roman life its meaning. And here is the thing that makes this feel so strangely modern. Infamia could be incurred not just through a crime or a verdict. It could be incurred through occupation alone. Actors were infamies. Gladiators were infamies. Prostitutes were infamies. And there was a particular category that I find almost unbearably interesting in its cultural specificity: undertakers. The people who prepared bodies for burial and organised funerals were infamous because they dealt with death in an official capacity, and death was considered a kind of pollution in Roman culture that contaminated the professional who handled it repeatedly. There is something almost absurdist about it. These people whose job was to help families navigate their most painful moments, excluded from civic life for their troubles. But the logic is consistent with everything else about infamia. It was about the purity of public reputation, about whether your presence in civic space enhanced or contaminated the collective dignity of the community. What I find genuinely fascinating is that successful actors and gladiators and entertainers were simultaneously infamous and enormously famous. Some of them were celebrated by crowds, were beloved by the public, were intimate with senators and emperors. The paradox sat uncomfortably in the Roman mind, and they never fully resolved it. A gladiator could be a popular hero and a legal non-person at the same time. Sounds impossibly contradictory, until you think about the modern entertainment industry, where celebrities can be both worshipped and held at a certain arm's length by the respectable world. But the most interesting dimension of infamia is not the legal one, it is the social one. Because infamia facti, infamia as a social fact, as opposed to infamia formally established by a court, was a separate and in some ways more powerful thing. You could suffer infamia facti without ever being convicted of anything, without any official verdict, simply through the spread of damaging rumours, through public reputation being destroyed by gossip, through the whisper campaigns that circulated in a city of 1 million people who lived close together and talked constantly. The Romans knew about gossip as a weapon. They had a word for reputation as a social phenomenon, fama, that carried connotations of both fame and rumour simultaneously. The same word meant what people said about you positively and what people said about you negatively. Because in Roman thinking, the two were inextricable. Your reputation was simply what other people said about you. It could make you or unmake you, and the content of what they said was almost secondary to the sheer volume and persistence of the saying. When Cicero wanted to destroy a political opponent in court, he did not simply argue the facts of the case. He painted a portrait of the man's entire character, his ancestors, his habits, his associates, his face, for goodness sake, designed to generate in the jury a feeling of revulsion so complete that the facts almost became secondary. Roman courts were not primarily about evidence in our sense. They were about reputation. Who are you? What is your character? What do people say about you? The jury's verdict was partly a referendum on social standing. I want to tell you about a moment in Roman history that shows exactly how this worked, and that has always stayed with me because of how recognizable it feels. In 62 years before the birth of Christ, a young Roman nobleman named Publius Clodius Pulcher managed to sneak into a religious ceremony that was exclusively for women. The ceremony was called the Bona Dea rites, the rites of the good goddess, and it was held that year in the house of Julius Caesar. Caesar's wife was hosting. No men were permitted. Clodius was reportedly dressed as a woman to get past the guards. He was allegedly there to see Caesar's wife, with whom rumours said he was having an affair. He was caught, recognized, and the city of Rome essentially lost its mind. The religious violation was serious. A sacred all-female ceremony had been desecrated by male presence. But what made this such a cultural earthquake was the reputational dimension. Caesar's household had been violated. Caesar's wife's honour was in question. And Caesar, who was at that moment consolidating his political position, could not afford the association. Caesar did not charge Clodius himself. He divorced his wife. When asked later why, if he believed she was innocent, he had still divorced her, Caesar gave an answer that has been quoted ever since. Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. Not guilty, not innocent, above suspicion. The standard was not truth but public perception. You did not need to actually be compromised. You needed to not even appear to be compromised. Because in Roman social logic, the appearance and the reality were functionally the same thing when it came to reputation. Does that sound familiar? Is there any domain of contemporary life in which appearing to be compromised ends careers and relationships just as effectively as being compromised? The answer, I think, is most of them. Now I want to be careful here, because there is a trap in drawing this particular comparison too broadly. The Romans were not simply proto-Twitter users. The dynamics of their reputation culture were embedded in a face-to-face society with very different power distributions, very different social hierarchies, and very different mechanisms for how information travelled. What spread in ancient Rome travelled person to person through conversation and letter, and it travelled slowly. A scandal could build for weeks before it reached someone in a provincial city. The feedback loops were slow. What we have today is feedback at the speed of light, scaled to reach billions rather than thousands. The core human impulse, to monitor what others think of us, to manage our social reputation, to feel the damage when it is threatened, is the same impulse that drove Roman social life. But the machinery is so vastly amplified that the ancient comparison, while illuminating, should not be mistaken for an exact parallel. What I am suggesting is something subtler, that the anxiety we feel about online reputation, the almost physical sensation of social standing as something real that can be built and lost, that anxiety is not a new bug introduced by technology. It is a very old feature of the Western social operating system. The Romans systematized it, formalized it, and built it into their legal structure. But the underlying human drive was there before them, and it will be here long after whatever platforms we are currently worried about have been replaced by things we cannot yet imagine. There is one more piece of this that I find both uncomfortable and genuinely important. The Romans, at their worst, used the threat of infamia as a tool of social control, to keep people in line, to enforce conformity, to punish those who deviated from the norms that the powerful had decided were correct. Actors were infamous not because they had done anything objectively harmful, but because their profession, performing in public, adopting other identities, displaying themselves for the entertainment of crowds, was seen as incompatible with the self-possession and gravitas that proper Roman life required. The judgment had nothing to do with their character. It had to do with the category they occupied, and categories, once applied, are extraordinarily hard to escape. This is one of the deepest tensions in any culture that organizes itself around reputation, the gap between the social label and the actual person. A gladiator who was gentle and thoughtful and kind to his family was still infamous. An actor who was, by every account that survives, a person of genuine decency and humour, was still excluded from the full rights of citizenship. The system could not reach inside the person to see who they actually were. It could only see what they did and what category that placed them in. We have not, I think, fully solved this problem. The machinery of social reputation still sometimes assigns categories faster and more permanently than any individual deserves. The court of public opinion, as Romans well knew, has never been especially interested in nuance. But here is where I want to leave this thought, because I think it is the most human and the most important thing about the whole concept of infamia. The Romans built an entire civilization partly on the premise that reputation matters, that how you are seen in your community affects not just your feelings, but your actual capacity to participate in civic life. that there are real social consequences to how you conduct yourself in public. That character, not just private character, but public character, the face you show to the world, is something worth building carefully and defending seriously. And for all the ways that system was abused, and for all the ways it trapped people in categories they could not escape, the core premise is not wrong. Reputation does matter. Character is worth building. How we treat each other in public spaces, whether those spaces are Roman forums or digital ones, has real consequences for the kind of community we create together. The Romans did not invent the human need for social belonging and social standing, but they thought about it with unusual seriousness, formalized it, and left us a set of words: dignitas, auctoritas, gravitas, infamia, that have never entirely left the Western vocabulary, even when their Latin form has been forgotten. Every time you feel the pull of wanting to be seen well, every time you feel the sting of public criticism, every time you measure yourself, even briefly, against what you imagine others think of you, you are feeling something. The Romans felt so deeply that they built it into their legal system. You're not anxious about social media. You're anxious about pharma, and pharma has been the human condition for a very, very long time. And with that in mind, with that understanding of how deeply the Roman preoccupation with reputation and honor shaped the way Western people experience themselves in public life, we arrive at what is perhaps the most ambitious of all Roman inheritances. Because we have talked about reputation as a social fact, but the Romans also thought deeply about something even harder. How do you actually build a society that stays free? Not just for one generation, but for centuries. How do you prevent the kind of power from accumulating in any one person's hands that would eventually undo everything? And the answer they reached, imperfect, flawed, ultimately not enough to save themselves, became the blueprint that the founders of every modern Western democracy studied, debated, argued over, and built upon: the veto, the Senate, the Republic itself. That story is coming right now. 494 years before the birth of Christ, and I want you to hold that date for a moment, because what happened in that year set in motion a chain of events that leads directly to the government you live under right now. 494 years before the birth of Christ, the Roman army walked off the job. Not the whole army. The plebeians, the ordinary non-aristocratic soldiers who made up the backbone of Rome's military, simply stopped. They marched out of the city, they climbed a hill outside Rome called the Sacred Mount, and they sat down. They were not waving weapons. They were not making explicit threats. They were doing something far more effective. They were demonstrating in the most concrete possible way that the aristocrats who ran Rome could not run Rome without them. That the patricians, those old wealthy families who monopolized the Senate, the magistracies, the priesthoods, and the courts, needed the plebeians more than the plebeians needed the patricians. That the city and its army would simply cease to function if the common people decided to withdraw their participation. The Romans called this a secessio plebis, a secession of the plebs, and it worked. The patricians, faced with the city that could not defend itself and an army that refused to move, negotiated. And what they negotiated in that pivotal year was an entirely new political office, the tribune of the plebs, a representative of the common people, elected by the common people, whose entire purpose was to stand between the plebeians and the arbitrary power of the patrician class. And then they gave this office a power unlike anything that had existed in Rome before, a power so simple, so absolute, so surgically precise, that it became one of the most consequential political inventions in human history. They called it the intercessio, the right of intervention, the right to say no, the right we know today by its Latin name, the veto. Veto is a Latin word. It means simply, I forbid. And it was, exactly as we still use it, a single person's ability to stop an action that would otherwise go forward. The tribune could stand in the Senate, or in the Assembly, or in the street in front of any official trying to do something harmful to the plebeians, and say those two words, and whatever was happening stopped. No explanation required, no court proceeding, no vote to override, just, I forbid. The power was intentionally blunt and intentionally absolute, because anything less would have been ineffective. The plebeians had tried more polite mechanisms and found them useless against a class of people who simply did not feel obligated to listen. What they needed was not another argument but a wall, a word that could not be argued around, delayed, or procedurally outmaneuvered. Veto, I forbid. And here is the thing I want to sit with for a moment. That word, that exact Latin word, with that exact meaning, is still in use right now. In the United States, when the president decides to block a bill that Congress has passed, the action is called a presidential veto. At the United Nations Security Council, when one of the 5 permanent members blocks a resolution, it is called a veto. The word is used in parliaments, in courts, in corporate boardrooms. 2,500 years of institutional memory compressed into 2 syllables. The Roman plebeians on the Sacred Mount could not have imagined that their political bargain would still be structuring governance in 253 countries. They were just trying to survive another year without being sold into debt slavery. But the veto was only one piece of what the Romans were building. Because the deeper genius of the Roman Republic, and I call it genius with genuine admiration, even knowing how badly it eventually failed, was the understanding that a single invention is never enough. That power is too resourceful and too persistent to be contained by any one mechanism. That you need many mechanisms, all working simultaneously, each designed to catch what the others miss. This is what we call checks and balances, and it is an idea that the Romans did not merely practice, they theorized. They wrote about it. They argued about it. They had philosophers and statesmen who tried to articulate exactly why multiple competing institutions, each with the ability to restrain the others, produced better government than any single centralized authority ever could. The most famous of these thinkers, at least among those whose writings directly shaped modern government, was a Greek historian named Polybius, who came to Rome in the 2nd century before the birth of Christ as a hostage, but stayed because he was fascinated by what he found there. Polybius wrote a landmark analysis of the Roman constitution in which he argued that Rome's success was not a matter of luck or military superiority. It was a matter of political design. The Romans had, through centuries of experiment and crisis and reform, built a system in which 3 different elements, the consuls, the Senate, and the people's assemblies, each had enough power to accomplish things, and each had enough power to prevent the others from doing too much. Balance. Not static balance, but dynamic balance. Constantly maintained through negotiation and mutual restraint. Polybius was writing for a Greek audience that had seen democracies collapse into tyrannies and oligarchies degenerate into chaos. His argument was that the Roman system worked because it combined all 3 classical forms: monarchy in the consuls, aristocracy in the Senate, democracy in the assemblies, without fully becoming any one of them. Each element was real enough to function. None was dominant enough to destroy the others. This analysis travelled through centuries. It shaped Cicero's thinking. It travelled into the political philosophy of the Renaissance. It was read by Montesquieu in the 18th century, who refined it and transmitted it to a generation of Enlightenment thinkers. and it arrived finally in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, where a group of men were sitting in the heat trying to design a government for a new nation. Here is a fact about the American founding that I find almost poignant in its directness. The men who wrote the Federalist Papers, the essays defending the new American Constitution, signed them under the pen name Publius, not a generic name, not a pseudonym they chose at random. Publius Valerius Publicola was a specific Roman statesman, one of the founders of the Roman Republic, who had helped establish the institutions that replaced the monarchy. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay were not just referencing Rome. They were claiming to stand in Rome's tradition. They were calling themselves Romans. Their opponents, the anti-federalists who argued against the Constitution, signed their own essays under names like Brutus and Cato, also specific Romans. Brutus, the senator who had helped preserve the Republic. Cato, the philosopher-statesman who had died rather than submit to Caesar. The entire debate about what kind of government the United States should have was conducted on both sides in the costume of Rome. These men were not merely inspired by Rome, they were obsessed with it. Thomas Jefferson kept a bust of Cicero in his study. John Adams wrote lengthy analyses of the Roman Constitution. James Madison, in his research notes for the Constitutional Convention, compiled extensive surveys of ancient republics, and the Roman Republic occupied a central place. What they were studying was not just institutional design, they were studying failure. They wanted to understand exactly how a republic that had lasted almost 500 years had finally collapsed. Why had checks and balances that worked for centuries eventually stopped working? What had broken? And could they design something that would not break in the same way? Let me tell you about the Roman institution they were most frightened of, and why they worked so hard to prevent its American equivalent. In times of extreme emergency, the Roman Republic had a provision for appointing a dictator. Not in the modern, pejorative sense of the word, though that usage descends from this, but a specific constitutional officer appointed by the Senate who received total executive authority for a period of up to 6 months. During that period, the dictator could not be vetoed, could not be checked by the tribunes, could not be blocked by his colleagues. He had, for those 6 months, essentially absolute power. The theory was that emergencies required decisive, unified action, and that the normal checks and balances were too slow for crisis. The practice, in the early Republic, worked reasonably well. The most famous early Roman dictator was a man named Cincinnatus, who was appointed in 458 years before the birth of Christ to lead Rome through a military crisis. Cincinnatus was allegedly ploughing his field when the Senate's messengers arrived to inform him of his appointment. He won the battle he was asked to win in 15 days, and then, before his 6-month term had even expired, he resigned and went back to his farm. The Romans told this story with reverence. Cincinnatus was their ideal of the man who could be trusted with absolute power precisely because he did not want it, who used it for the purpose for which it was given and then immediately put it down. George Washington's contemporaries called him the American Cincinnatus. The city of Cincinnati in Ohio was named after this Roman image. The Society of the Cincinnati, an organization of Revolutionary War officers, took both their name and their stated ethos from the same source. The idea that the greatest leader is the one who surrenders power voluntarily, the one who could keep it but chooses not to. This was Roman. It was Cincinnatus. And it was one of the organizing principles of how the American founders thought about what kind of leadership they were building toward. The dictator provision in the later Republic stopped working when men arose who were willing to use it not as a temporary emergency measure, but as a permanent seizure of power. Sulla used it to reorganize the Roman state in his own image, and then resigned, but his reforms did not hold. Julius Caesar was appointed dictator and then, in 44 years before the birth of Christ, was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. No 6-month term, no sunset clause, just forever. And the Senate understood what that meant. The men who put daggers into Caesar on the Ides of March were not in their own minds revolutionaries or assassins. They were defenders of the Republic. They believed that a dictator perpetuo was the constitutional death of everything Rome had built. They were right about what Caesar's appointment meant. They were wrong about what killing him would accomplish. The American founders saw Caesar's story as a warning and designed around it. The presidency would have a fixed term, no Roman-style dictator provision. The emergency powers of the executive would be real but limited. Ambition would be made to counteract ambition. That phrase, which James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, is in essence a restatement of what Polybius had said about the Roman constitution 2,000 years earlier. The insight is identical, only the institution changed. And the Senate, they kept that word Senate directly from the Latin, unchanged. The American Senate is, etymologically and conceptually, a Roman institution. The word means council of elders, from senex, the Latin for old man. The Romans had begun with a council of the heads of great families, evolved into an institution of experienced statesmen, and refined it over 5 centuries into the dominant deliberative body of the Republic. Madison and his colleagues took the word, the concept, and the fundamental design, a body that deliberates slowly, that represents established interests, that provides a break on the potentially hasty passions of more democratic institutions, and transplanted it into the American system. The term limits, the regular elections, the idea that power should rotate rather than accumulate, the impeachment process, removing an official not through violence but through structured legal proceedings, the idea that the legislature controls the purse strings while the executive controls the military. All of these structural decisions trace lines back through Montesquieu and back further through Polybius, and back further still to the actual lived experience of the Roman Republic trying and often failing to keep power in balance. I want to be honest with you about something, though, because the story deserves that honesty. The Roman Republic failed. After nearly 500 years, it collapsed into civil war and dictatorship. The checks and balances that Polybius had admired, that worked for generations, eventually broke down. The institutions that were supposed to contain ambition were captured by the ambitious. The Senate that was supposed to represent the public interest became a vehicle for factional warfare. The tribunate that was supposed to protect the people was used as a weapon by populist demagogues. The armies that were supposed to serve the Republic started serving their generals instead. The American founders knew this. They studied the failure as carefully as they studied the success. What they were trying to design was not a copy of Rome. They knew a copy would eventually fail the same way, but a version that incorporated Rome's lessons while trying to guard against Rome's weaknesses. The fixed terms, the prohibition on standing armies in peacetime, the separation of civilian and military authority, the Bill of Rights as a protection against majoritarian tyranny. Whether they succeeded, whether what they built is robust enough to survive the pressures of the centuries that followed, is a question that every generation has to answer for itself, in its own time, with its own institutions either holding or bending under the weight of what is asked of them. The Romans built something extraordinary and watched it fail from within. The failure was not inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people at specific moments, choices that allowed ambition to override institutional loyalty, that let private interest overpower civic duty. Here is what I think about quietly when I consider all of this. The Roman Republic lasted almost 500 years. 5 centuries of republican government, imperfect but real, with real elections and real debate and real mechanisms for holding power accountable. That is a longer period of constitutional self-governance than most modern democracies have yet experienced. The Romans were not naive. They were not idealists. They were practical, tough, often cynical people who had learned from bitter experience that power corrupts and that no person should be trusted with too much of it. They built their institutions in full awareness of human weakness, including their own, and still they lost it. Not all at once. Gradually, then suddenly, as the saying goes, institutions that had held for centuries stopped holding. Norms that had restrained ambition for generations stopped being respected. And once the restraint went, the whole structure followed quickly. We carry this inheritance, the veto, the Senate, the Republic, the term limits, the checks and balances, all of it Roman in its bones, even when we've forgotten the Latin. And alongside the inheritance, we carry the question that the Romans never fully answered. How do you maintain a republic across generations in the face of the permanent human tendency to want more power than is good for any person or any faction to have? That question, Rome's great unanswered question, is still very much our question. And yet, even as we sit with that, there is something I've been holding back for this entire journey. Something that might be the most intimate, the most daily, the most surprisingly Roman thing about your life. Not the laws that govern you, not the government that represents you, not the roads under your feet or the words in your mouth, but something about the way a table is set for dinner, the order of courses, the idea that a meal is a social event, not just a biological necessity, and how the Romans turned eating together into one of the most politically and socially powerful rituals of their civilization, in ways that you enact, without knowing it, every single time you sit down with other people and share food. Think about the last time you sat down with people you care about to share a meal, not eating something quickly over your phone or grabbing food in the car, but an actual intentional meal. Maybe it was a birthday dinner, or a holiday, or just a Sunday night with family. There was probably a starter of some kind, then a main dish, then dessert, or at least something sweet at the end. You did not design that sequence. You inherited it, and it is older than you might expect. The 3-course meal, appetizer, main course, dessert, is a structure so deeply embedded in Western dining culture that we barely notice it as a structure at all. It just seems like the correct order of things. You start light, you build to the main event, you finish with something sweet. This feels natural, logical, almost biological. But it is not biological, it is Roman. The Romans had a word for dinner that I have always found beautiful, convivium. It means a living together. Not eating together, living together. The Romans understood in the way they named things that a shared meal was not primarily a biological event but a social one. That the table was where the community of a household, and by extension, the community of a city, of a civilization, renewed itself, and the structure of their dinner was precise. A proper Roman dinner, called the cena, was divided into 3 parts. First came the gustatio, the starter, the appetizer, the course designed to awaken the appetite and set the tone for what was to follow. This might be small dishes of eggs, salted fish, olives, herbs, or raw vegetables. The purpose was not to fill but to stimulate, to tell the body and the conversation that something more was coming. Then came the prima mensa, literally the first table, which was the main course. This was the heart of the meal. Meats, more substantial fish dishes, cooked vegetables, accompanied by wine that flowed throughout. The word mensa referred to the small tables on which each course was brought to the diners. When you finished the first table, it was literally removed and replaced by the next. And finally, the secunda mensa, the second table, which was the dessert. Fruits, sweet pastries, nuts, honey-dressed dishes. The gentle, satisfying conclusion. The course that was supposed to leave guests feeling pleasantly full but not overwhelmed, sweet in their mouths and in their conversation. Gustatio, prima mensa, secunda mensa, appetizer, main course, dessert. This is the same structure that you follow today when you eat formally. The same sequence, the same logic, the same arc from light to substantial to sweet. The English words have changed. The food on the plates has changed beyond recognition. But the skeleton of the meal, the invisible architecture of how Western cultures believe a proper dinner should be organized, was designed in Rome, but the structure was only the beginning. Because what made the Roman dinner genuinely extraordinary, and what I think made it one of the most consequential social institutions in Western history, was what happened during those hours around the table. The Romans named their dinner parties convivium, living together, because they understood something that modern life sometimes forgets, that the act of sitting down together and eating the same food, in the same room, at the same pace, is one of the most powerful bonding mechanisms that human beings possess. It is hard to hate someone while you're sharing their bread. It is difficult to remain strangers when you have eaten from the same dishes and drunk from the same wine. At a Roman dinner party, the guest list was assembled with the same deliberateness as any modern social event, but the stakes were higher. An invitation to someone's triclinium was a statement of relationship. It placed you in a network of obligations. The host owed his guests hospitality. The guests owed the host their continued loyalty and goodwill. Political alliances were formed over dinners. Business arrangements were made. Introductions that would shape careers were engineered. Favors were asked and granted in an atmosphere of shared pleasure that made refusal socially costly. One Roman writer put it plainly: a well-timed dinner invitation could be more politically effective than a speech in the Senate, because the Senate was a formal adversarial space. The triclinium was intimate. It was the host's home. The rules there were softer. The wine flowed. The music played. And people who were enemies in the forum could find themselves, 3 hours into a dinner, in the middle of a conversation that would have been impossible to have in any other setting. Do you recognize that? The way a shared meal can thaw things that formal meetings cannot. The way business deals get done at dinners that were never going to get done in conference rooms. The way families that struggle to talk about difficult things can sometimes manage it around the dinner table in a way they cannot manage it anywhere else. That is not a modern discovery. The Romans knew it 2,000 years ago, and they built their social and political life deliberately around the dinner table, in the full knowledge of its power. Now let me tell you about Trimalchio's dinner, because it is one of the most entertaining and most revealing documents of Roman social life that has survived to us. Around the 1st century after the birth of Christ, a Roman writer known as Petronius Arbiter wrote a satirical novel called the Satyricon. It is barely readable in places, fragmentary, scandalous, richly strange. But at its centre is a scene so vivid that scholars have been analysing it for 2,000 years, the dinner party of Trimalchio. Trimalchio was a fictional character, but he was based on a recognisable type. He was a former slave who'd become fabulously wealthy through trade, a self-made man in the most literal sense, in a society that looked down on people who made their money in commerce rather than inheriting it from old aristocratic families. And Trimalchio's dinner was designed to show everyone, in the most spectacular possible way, just how much money he now had. The meal begins with a tray arranged in the shape of the 12 signs of the zodiac, with appropriate foods placed on each sign. A rooster's egg appears, and when cracked, contains a fat beccafico bird pickled in spiced yolk. A whole roasted boar arrives, wearing a freedman's cap with live thrushes flying out of its belly when it is cut open. The bird's immediately caught by servants who cook and serve them as the next dish. A whole pig is served, and when the host pretends to be angry that it was not gutted properly and orders the cook to gut it at the table, sausages and puddings cascade out of its belly. There is a retractable ceiling that drops garlands and gift boxes on the guests. There is theatrical music. There are slaves who appear and disappear with choreographed precision. Petronius is mocking all of this. He is satirizing Trimalchio's vulgarity, his desperate need to impress, his fundamental misunderstanding of what the convivium was supposed to be. For Petronius, writing from the perspective of the educated Roman elite, Trimalchio has confused spectacle with substance. He has made his dinner about himself, his wealth, his cleverness, his ingenuity. When a proper dinner should be about the community of guests, about conversation and genuine hospitality and the gentle pleasure of good food shared in good company. But here is what I find interesting. Petronius's mockery of Trimalchio assumes that the reader shares his values about what a dinner should be. The satire only works if the audience already knows what a good dinner looks like and can see why Trimalchio's extravaganza is a grotesque parody of it. Which means that the Roman ideal of the convivium was legible enough, clear enough in its standards, that a satirist could invoke it as a measuring stick without having to explain it. The Romans had thought very carefully about what made a good dinner, and the answer they came to, in the letters of Pliny the Younger, in the essays of Cicero, in the poetry of Martial and Horace, was not the food. The food mattered, but it was secondary. What made a dinner good was the conversation. Cicero has a wonderful line about this that has stayed with me. He describes a dinner in the countryside with Cato the Elder and his neighbours, lingering over dessert and wine until late at night, and he says that Cato found in those long evenings the finest pleasure of civilized life. Not the food, not the wine, the talk. The fact that at the end of the meal, when the hunger was satisfied and the formality had relaxed, people said what they actually thought. They shared ideas. They argued gently. They told stories. They became, for a few hours, more fully themselves, and Cato had a specific word for this, which Cicero preserves with evident approval. He preferred the Latin word convivium, living together, to the Greek word symposium, which meant simply drinking together, because Cato believed that the point of the gathering was not the wine but the living, the companionship, the shared humanity of sitting still long enough to actually know the people you were with. That distinction between a social event organised around a substance and one organised around people feels relevant, doesn't it? Between a party where everyone is there for the alcohol or the entertainment or the spectacle, and a dinner where the point is genuinely to be present with each other. The Romans were not always good at the distinction, as Trimalchio abundantly demonstrates. But they named it. They honoured it. They built their most important social rituals around the aspiration of it, even when they fell short in practice. And the Roman dining table left one more legacy that I want to mention before we move on, because it is hiding in plain sight every time you sit down for a formal meal. The formal table setting, the way the silverware is arranged, the order in which glasses appear, the placement of bread plates and water glasses and dessert spoons. This ritual of the elaborately set table descends from Roman practice. Not in a straight line, but through the French tradition of haute cuisine that codified European formal dining in the 17th and 18th centuries, which itself drew heavily from Roman precedents that had survived through the medieval monastery tradition and the Renaissance revival of classical texts. The Roman word for a spoon, cochlea, gives us the biological term cochlea, the spiral-shaped part of your inner ear, so named because it resembled a small shell, and shells were eaten with spoons at Roman dinner tables so frequently that the shape became the name. The word companion comes from the Latin com, meaning together, and pain, meaning bread. A companion is literally someone you break bread with. The most intimate word the Western languages have for a close friend encodes the Roman idea that sharing a meal is the foundation of human connection, and the tradition of toasting, raising a glass to another person's health, comes from Roman dining custom, where wine was shared as a ritual acknowledgement of the bonds between guests. The Romans took their toasts seriously. Drinking to someone's health was a genuine gesture of care, not mere formality. I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it is actually one of the more hopeful Roman inheritances on this list. In a world of screens and constant motion, and meals eaten alone in front of content we are consuming rather than people we are engaging, the Roman conviction that the dinner table is the foundational institution of human civilization does not feel outdated. It feels like something worth protecting. The Romans built their entire social fabric around the table. Their political alliances, their family bonds, their philosophical friendships, their business relationships, all of it ran through the ritual of the shared meal. They understood that eating together does something to human beings that no other activity quite replicates. It slows you down. It equalizes you. Everyone at the table is in the same position, performing the same basic biological act. It creates a shared experience in real time, and if you let it, it creates the conditions for genuine conversation. Not the performance of conversation, but the thing itself. Gustatio. Prima mensa. Secunda mensa. Start light. Build to the main thing. End sweet. That is not just a recipe for dinner. It is almost a recipe for a conversation. Almost a recipe for a relationship. We have spent the last stretch of this evening walking through 10 layers of Roman inheritance. Time, ceremony, language, law, cities, roads, water, reputation, government, and the table. And each time, what I find most striking is not how different the Romans were from us, but how continuous the thread is. How the things they figured out, sometimes through elegance, sometimes through trial and brutal error, became so embedded in our institutions and habits and language that we stopped noticing them at all. But there are 2 more layers to this story. 2 more inheritances that I've been holding back, because they are perhaps the most unexpected of all. The first is something the Romans did to the very concept of property. Not just what you own, but how the act of owning shapes who you are in the eyes of the law and the eyes of your community, in ways that still define what it means to be an adult in Western society. The second is the most intimate inheritance of all. The Roman ideas about the body, about medicine, about what we owe our physical selves, ideas so persistent that they are still shaping the way doctors speak and patients think, more than 2 millennia after the first Roman physician set down his instruments. Both of those are coming right now, and I think you are going to be surprised by how close to home they land. The next time a doctor hands you a prescription, take a moment to look at the paper before you put it in your bag, not at the instructions, at the language, the words, the abbreviations, the way the medication's name is constructed. There is a very high probability that what you are holding contains Latin. Not Latin-inspired. Latin. The actual language in abbreviated form still directing your medical care from across 2,000 years of history. Per os, taken by mouth. Statim, immediately, often shortened to stat on hospital orders, which is why nurses move fast when they hear that word called out. In situ, in its original place, used in oncology to describe cancer that has not yet spread. Corpus, body, vena, vein, cutis, skin, rectus, straight. Every bone, every muscle, every organ in your body has a name, and the vast majority of those names are Latin. The skeleton you carry around every day of your life was named, bone, by people who were writing and thinking in Rome before any of the nations you might call home existed. This is where Roman influence reaches into perhaps the most intimate place of all, the body itself. Medicine in ancient Rome is a subject that tends to make modern people a little queasy, and understandably so. The Romans inherited Greek medical theory, which was built on the concept of 4 bodily humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. The theory held that health was a matter of balance between these 4 fluids, and disease was the result of one of them becoming excessive or deficient. Treatment therefore often involved removing whatever seemed to be an excess, bleeding patients who were feverish, purging those who seemed to have too much of something, adjusting diet to correct perceived imbalances. By modern standards, much of this was wrong. Bleeding patients was, in many cases, actively harmful. It weakened people who were already ill, occasionally hastening deaths that might otherwise have been prevented. Galen, the most influential physician of the Roman Empire, bled patients with such enthusiasm that when one patient died in his care, the other doctors present joked, with dark humour, that he had slaughtered the fever. Galen himself recorded this remark without seeming to find it particularly damning, and yet Galen, born in 129 years after the birth of Christ in Pergamon, a city in what is now Turkey, was also the man who demonstrated that the larynx generates the voice, who identified the difference between venous and arterial blood, who performed systematic dissections on animals to understand the structure of the body, and recorded his findings in such meticulous detail that his anatomical texts remained standard medical references for 1,500 years, who argued against the prevailing belief of his time that the brain, not the heart, was the organ that controlled the body and the mind. He was right about the brain. He was catastrophically wrong about bleeding patients. Both things are true simultaneously, and the fact that a single person could be so right about some fundamental questions and so wrong about others, and that his influence persisted for 15 centuries largely intact, should probably make us think carefully about how we regard the experts of our own era. To understand why Galen mattered so much and why his influence lasted so extraordinarily long, you have to understand the circumstances of his career. Galen came to Rome in 162 years after the birth of Christ, and rose with startling speed. He was brilliant, he was ambitious, and he was a performer. He gave public demonstrations of anatomy in which he would expose and manipulate living nerves to show how the body worked. He cured wealthy patients that other physicians had given up on. He argued loudly and in public with anyone who challenged his methods, and he won those arguments often enough that his reputation became formidable. Eventually he was appointed personal physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a man widely regarded as one of the wisest and most thoughtful rulers Rome ever produced. Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher who spent his reign doing his best to govern with wisdom and restraint, and who found in Galen a physician who shared his conviction that medicine required both observation and reason. Marcus Aurelius apparently said of Galen, "We have one physician, and he is a consummate gentleman." Coming from a philosopher-emperor, that was a remarkable thing to say about a doctor. The combination of his imperial patronage, his enormous output. He wrote more than 400 treatises, of which roughly 150 survive, and his synthesis of everything the ancient world knew about medicine meant that Galen became, after his death, essentially the single authoritative source on what medicine was. Medieval universities taught Galen. Arab scholars translated and expanded on Galen. European Renaissance physicians began their lectures with acknowledgments to Galen. When the anatomist Andreas Vesalius began correcting Galen's errors in the 16th century, he was doing something that required genuine intellectual courage, not merely updating old information, but challenging a figure of almost sacred authority. Galen's stranglehold on medicine was so complete that when Vesalius discovered, through direct dissection of human cadavers, that Galen had made errors because Galen had been forced to work primarily with animal bodies, since Roman law prohibited human dissection, some of Galen's defenders argued that human anatomy must have changed since the ancient era. Rather than accept that Galen was wrong, they preferred to believe that the human body itself had evolved incorrectly. That is the level of authority that Rome's medical tradition accumulated. Not just respected, not just influential, treated as almost divinely correct, to the point that the evidence of direct observation was questioned rather than the texts. But I want to set aside the errors and the authority and the sometimes tragic consequences of getting medicine wrong, and focus instead on something that I think gets overlooked. What the Roman world got profoundly right about the relationship between health and society. The Romans believed, and this was a public policy position, not merely personal philosophy, that the health of the population was a civic responsibility, not everyone's personal problem, a civic responsibility. This showed up in concrete ways. Emperor Augustus established the first professional military medical corps in the Western world. Trained doctors were attached to Roman legions, and their job was not just to treat wounds in battle, but to maintain the health of soldiers through disease prevention, sanitation, and organized care. The Romans built hospitals, valetudinaria, near military camps across the empire systematically, as a matter of standard military practice. What we would today call field hospitals, with dedicated staff, organized patient care, and written medical records, were a Roman institution. They also built public bathhouses not just as social amenities, but with a genuine understanding that cleanliness reduced illness. They buried their dead outside city walls to prevent disease. They drained swamps near populated areas because they had observed that swampy areas tended to correlate with illness. They did not know about mosquitoes and the diseases they carry, but they had correctly identified the pattern, and they acted on it. The Roman concept of miasma, bad air from rotting matter, was wrong about the mechanism, but the practical response to it, of draining swamps and improving sanitation, was right about the effect. What this represents is empirical public health, not scientific in the modern sense. They did not understand germ theory, which was not formulated until the 19th century, but they were watching, recording, and responding to what they observed, and they had enough institutional capacity to implement large-scale interventions. Now, the lasting inheritance. Because none of this would matter to us as much as it does if Roman medicine had simply stopped when the empire ended. But it did not stop. The medical vocabulary that was systematized in Rome, the Latin terminology that named every bone, every muscle, every organ, every anatomical relationship, became the universal language of Western medicine. When scholars at the University of Bologna began dissecting human bodies in the medieval period, the language they used for what they found was Latin. When Vesalius published his landmark Anatomical Atlas in 1543, the most accurate mapping of the human body that the world had yet seen, he wrote it in Latin, using the Roman anatomical vocabulary that Galen and Celsus had established. When European doctors travelled from country to country, they could speak to each other not because they shared a native language, but because they shared Latin. In Danish hospitals, according to historical records, doctors were still writing their patient notes in Latin as late as 1853. The language of Roman medicine outlasted Latin as a spoken tongue by many centuries, preserved in the protected space of medical practice because everyone understood that precision in medicine requires a shared, stable vocabulary. And no shared, stable vocabulary existed except the Roman one. Even today, when Latin has essentially vanished from everyday life, it persists in medicine in ways that go beyond mere historical curiosity. Anatomy is still largely Latin. The formal names of bones, muscles, tendons, and ligaments in the official anatomical nomenclature are Latin. Medical prescriptions still use Latin abbreviations. The word prescription itself comes from Latin praescriptum, something written before, a preliminary instruction. Diagnosis from Greek via Latin. Prognosis from Greek via Latin. Symptom from Greek via Latin. The word patient from Latin patientem, one who is suffering, enduring. Every time a doctor asks, "Where does it hurt?" and begins to formulate what might be wrong with you, the conceptual framework into which their thinking flows, the categories of diagnosis, the vocabulary of anatomy, the structure of clinical reasoning, was shaped by the Roman world's preservation and systematization of ancient knowledge. I want to tell you about one specific Roman medical insight that I find genuinely remarkable, because it feels so modern that it is hard to believe it was formulated 2,000 years ago. Galen argued in multiple texts that emotional states could cause physical illness, that grief, sustained anxiety, and unresolved mental distress could manifest as symptoms in the body. Digestive problems, disturbed sleep, weakened constitution, susceptibility to disease. He did not have the words we would use today. He did not speak of the autonomic nervous system or cortisol or the stress response. But he was describing the same phenomenon. He saw, in his patients, that those who were deeply unhappy tended to stay ill longer and respond less well to treatment. That the mind and the body were not separate territories governed by different laws, but a single system in which what happened in one inevitably affected the other. His concept of pneuma, a vital force that mediated between the soul and the body, was speculative and eventually wrong in its specific claims. But the underlying observation that mental states have physical consequences and that treating the body without attending to the mind is incomplete medicine, that observation was correct. It is what we now call the field of psychosomatic medicine, and it is an area of genuine and growing research in the 21st century. Galen saw it first, not in those terms and not with the tools to prove it, but he saw it, and he wrote it down. Have you ever thought about why doctors often seem to speak a language that patients cannot quite follow? Why medical consultations can feel like being addressed in a foreign tongue? Why the words that describe what is happening inside your body often feel distant, almost alien, from the ordinary language in which you experience that body from the inside? Part of the answer is that medical vocabulary was never designed to be accessible to patients. It was designed to be precise for practitioners. It was designed to travel across languages and centuries without losing its meaning. The decision to build Western medicine on a Latin and Greek vocabulary was the Roman world's gift of precision to the future, and it came with the unavoidable cost of distance. When your doctor says periorbital edema, they mean that the area around your eye is swollen. Both things are literally true, and only one of them requires a medical degree to understand. This is not a small tension. The history of medicine is, in many ways, the history of a gap between the language of practitioners and the language of patients, between the Roman professional vocabulary and the vernacular experience of the body. Some of the most important reforms in modern medicine have been about closing that gap. Informed consent, plain language medical communication, patient-centered care. All of it is at some level an attempt to bring what the Romans built, the rigorous, precise, universal language of medicine, into relationship with the people it is supposed to serve, to keep the precision and recover the accessibility. That is the inheritance. The vocabulary that runs through every hospital corridor, every medical school lecture, every prescription pad on every doctor's desk. Roman. Carried forward by scholars and translators and physicians across 15 centuries, arriving in your doctor's office as if it had always been there, which, in a sense, it has. And as I think about all of this, the vocabulary, the framework, the Roman conviction that health is both a private and a public concern, the long chain of inheritance from Galen through the medieval universities, through Vesalius, through the modern clinic, I find myself returning to a question that has been quietly sitting at the centre of this entire journey. Not what did Rome leave us? We have spent the last several hours answering that. The calendar, the wedding ring, the language in your head, the law above your hand, the city grid, the road, the water, the reputation economy, the republic, the dinner table, the doctor's vocabulary. The list is astonishingly long. The question is, what do we do with this? Now that we know, now that the invisible architecture has been pointed out, and the Roman fingerprints have been found in places we never thought to look, what changes? What should change? Or is awareness itself the gift, the simple act of knowing what we carry and where it came from? That is where we're going next, and I promise you, the answer is worth staying awake for. Somewhere in the middle of our long journey tonight, I said something that I want to come back to now, at the end. I said that when an empire falls, it does not die, it dissolves into everything. Rome fell in the 5th century after the birth of Christ. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain in 476 years after the birth of Christ. He was not killed. He was exiled to a castle in southern Italy and given a pension. The man who replaced him, Odoacer, did not even bother to declare himself emperor. He understood that the title had become hollow, that the institution it represented had already essentially ceased to function. He simply sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople and said, in effect, "We will not be needing this anymore." And on that quiet, almost undramatic afternoon in 476, the Western Roman Empire officially ended. No great battle, no burning of a capital, just an administrative act, a dispatch, and a teenager sent into comfortable exile. Yet what dissolved in that moment? What actually ended? The answer, remarkably, is very little of what we've talked about tonight. The calendar did not end. The months that Julius Caesar had organized continued, and continue today, to mark every day of your life. The legal principles did not end. The presumption of innocence, the concept of absolute ownership, the idea of written, public, consistently applied law, all of these travelled forward through the medieval legal scholars who spent their careers studying and transmitting the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great compilation of Roman law that the Emperor Justinian had assembled in the 6th century. The language did not end. Latin fragmented into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, the Romance languages, the children of Rome, and its vocabulary pressed forward into English, into scientific terminology, into legal Latin, into the medical language that still names every bone in your body. The roads did not end. They were maintained, extended, and eventually built over. But the routes themselves, the surveyed lines through the landscape, the places where populations clustered because the Roman road made them accessible, those persisted for centuries and became the skeleton of European travel and commerce. The water did not end. The Aqua Virgo still flows, 2,044 years after it was built, carrying water through Roman channels to the fountains of Rome, including the most famous fountain in the world. The Republic did not end. its forms, its vocabulary, its essential logic, checks and balances, veto, senate, term limits, separation of powers. All of this travelled forward in texts that the Renaissance rediscovered, that Montesquieu analysed, that the American founders devoured with what can only be described as intellectual obsession. The Roman Empire fell. The Roman idea did not fall at all. I've been thinking during these hours we've spent together about what the right analogy is for what Rome did, and I keep coming back to this. Imagine a river. It flows for centuries, cutting a channel through rock and earth, altering the landscape as it moves. And then, due to drought or earthquake, or simply the slow change of terrain, the river dries up. The water is gone. The river as a river ceases to exist, but the channel it cut is still there. The valley it carved is still there. All the settlements that grew up along its banks are still there. The soil it enriched is still there. Every future river, every irrigation ditch, every road that follows the natural path of least resistance through that landscape, all of them will follow, at least in part, the channel that the original river cut, because the original river made that the path of least resistance forever after. That is what Rome did to Western civilization. It cut the channel. And even now that the water of the empire itself is long gone, the landscape it shaped still directs the flow of human activity in ways that are so fundamental and so old that we mistake them for nature. We think the three-course dinner is natural. We think that a ring goes on the left hand. We think that innocent until proven guilty is simply obvious, self-evident, the only moral way to treat an accused person. We think that cities should have grids and water should flow to people, and the state should have branches that check each other, and bodies should have names in Latin. None of it is natural. All of it is Roman. So what do we do with that, now that we know? I have thought about this genuinely, because I do not want to leave you with only the historical version of the question. The practical version matters more. Here is what I think. When you know where your inherited ideas come from, you gain something that cannot be acquired any other way. The ability to choose, not the illusion of choice, the real thing. Because as long as you think that the way you structure time or organize a dinner or run a government or treat a person accused of wrongdoing is simply the natural, obvious way to do things, you cannot actually examine it. You can only perform it automatically, like muscle memory. But once you know that these ideas have an origin, that they were invented by particular people in particular circumstances for particular reasons, you can ask the questions that you could not ask before. Is this still the right idea? Does this structure still serve the purpose for which it was designed? Have the circumstances changed enough that we need something different? Or is this one of those ideas that has proved robust enough across 2,000 years of changing circumstances that it deserves our continued trust? The Romans themselves understood this. Their word for the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors was mus maiorum, the way of the ancestors, the ancestral custom. And the Romans held the mus maiorum in great reverence. But they also, the best of them, understood that inherited custom was not the same as eternal truth, that the reason you respected the ancestors was not because they were always right, but because they had thought carefully about difficult problems and their thinking was worth engaging with seriously. The examination of Rome's inheritance is not nostalgia. It is not the claim that the Romans were better than us, or that we should try to live as they lived. It is the practice of taking seriously the thinking of people who faced hard problems and left us their solutions, and then doing the thing that every generation must do, deciding which solutions to keep, which to adapt, and which to finally, respectfully, put down. There is something else I want to say, and it is perhaps the most personal thing I have said in these many hours together, When I first became genuinely interested in Roman history, not in the battles and the emperors, which are well-covered territory, but in the quiet everyday texture of how Roman people organized their lives, what struck me most powerfully was not the sophistication, it was the familiarity. The way Roman letters and diaries and legal documents and dinner party conversations feel recognizable across 2,000 years of distance. The way a Roman mother writing to her son about his health, or a Roman businessman complaining about a late delivery, or a Roman politician scheming to outmaneuver a rival, or a Roman poet sitting by a fountain and thinking about what it means to live well. All of them feel like people I might know, not copies of modern people, but genuinely human in the same ways that we are human. And I think that familiarity is not accidental. The reason Roman people feel recognizable is partly because we've inherited their vocabulary and their institutions and their habits. We think the way they taught us to think. We argue the way they taught us to argue. We organize time and space and law and the dinner table the way they taught us to organize these things. We are not their descendants in blood, most of us, but we are their heirs in culture. And culture is not a less real inheritance than blood. In some ways it is more real, because it was chosen, transmitted deliberately, copied and preserved and passed forward by people who believed it was worth passing forward. Every generation between us and Rome made that choice. They could have let the Latin vocabulary go. They could have abandoned the legal principles, redesigned the calendar, forgotten the dinner customs, stopped teaching the Republic's history to their children. Some of these things did get lost for a while and had to be recovered, but enough survived generation by generation to arrive here, to arrive tonight, in this quiet conversation between us. That is an extraordinary amount of human effort and intention. 2,000 years of people deciding that something was worth keeping. I want to end with a number that stays with me. When the Roman Empire was at its largest, under the Emperor Hadrian in around 117 years after the birth of Christ, it contained approximately 60 to 70 million people. At that moment, the entire population of the world was perhaps 250 million. Rome held somewhere between a quarter and a third of all the people who were alive. Every day, those 60 or 70 million people woke up and organized their time with Roman months and Roman days. They lived in cities planned on Roman grids. They walked on Roman roads. They drank water from Roman aqueducts. They were governed by Roman law. They spoke Latin or Greek, and both languages were shaped by Roman educational practice. They ate their dinners in the Roman order of courses. They understood their own bodies using Roman medical vocabulary. They worried about their Roman reputation and their Roman honor. They cast their votes, those who had them, in systems whose structure was Roman. And then the empire fell. And the ideas it had embedded in 60 million lives spread to the teachers who taught the next generation, and the merchants who traded across the old Roman routes, and the monks who copied the old Roman texts, and the scholars who read those texts in medieval universities, and the lawyers who applied those principles in courts across Europe, and the statesmen who invoked Roman precedent when designing new republics, and the doctors who named every bone in the bodies of their patients in Latin. The ideas kept travelling, keep travelling, are travelling right now through your life on this particular night as you lie still and let these words settle in. 60 million people 2,000 years ago, and their organising ideas are still here, still shaping the frame through which billions of people experience their days. That, I think, is the most extraordinary fact about Rome, not the Colosseum, not the legions, not the roads, though the roads are astonishing. The most extraordinary thing about Rome is that it thought about human life carefully enough and organised those thoughts systematically enough that 2,000 years and the complete collapse of its political and military power were not enough to dislodge them. The calendar on your wall, the ring on your finger, the innocent until proven guilty, the road under your wheels, the structure of your government, the 3 courses of your dinner, the Latin name of the bone in your wrist, all of it Roman, all of it yours. And I'm so glad you stayed with me tonight through all of it. Every one of you who made it this far, through the calendar and the wedding customs, through the language and the law, through the roads and the water and the bread and circuses, through the republic and the dinner table and the doctor's vocabulary, you have done something that I find genuinely moving. You have spent hours paying attention to things that most of the world never notices, because most of the world is busy living inside those things, not looking at them. That kind of attention matters. That is how the inheritance gets examined rather than just performed, and the examination is where the real freedom is. If you found something tonight that surprised you, I hope you carry it with you. If something made you think about your own life differently, I hope the thinking continues. And if there is someone in your life who would love to know that the month of September is named after a Latin word for 7th, but arrives as the 9th month because of a Roman king who added 2 months to the beginning of the year, and nobody ever got around to renaming everything, please share this with them. That kind of fact deserves a wider audience. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening. Thank you for your curiosity. Thank you for the comments and the shares and the quiet companionship of watching something together in the dark. You are the reason this is worth making. And the next story, the next long, quiet, late-night journey is already waiting. It is a different kind of inheritance story, one that will take you somewhere unexpected, somewhere that will make you look at another ordinary part of your daily life and wonder, the same way you are wondering right now, how long it has been there without you noticing. Rest well, sleep deeply, and carry Rome lightly with you, because you already were, you just did not know it yet.